It started with a sound, a faint crunching noise outside my window. It was the kind of sound snow makes when you step on it. Soft but unmistakable. 2:37 a.m. Too late for anyone to be wandering around. My neighborhood was quiet, tucked away in the woods where no one ever had any reason to visit. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon maybe, but something felt wrong. The sound wasn't random, like an animal digging or scurrying. It was steady, deliberate. Footsteps. My bed creaked as I got up, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek through. The pale light of the moon reflected off the snow-covered ground, casting long, eerie shadows from the trees. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then, movement caught my eye. A figure, far enough away that I couldn't make out details, was walking through the snow. My stomach twisted. Who could it be? The nearest house was half a mile away, and the trail leading here was almost impossible to find, unless you knew where to look. I stayed frozen, my superscute breath fogging the glass as I watched the figure move closer. They weren't running or wandering, aimlessly. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding. What should I do? My phone was on the kitchen counter downstairs, and I suddenly regretted not keeping it with me. Grabbing a flashlight, I inched toward the stairs. The house was silent except for the creak of the wood steps under my weight. Every sound seemed magnified, and I winced at each tiny noise. When I reached the bottom, I hesitated. The front yard. If the person was still outside, they might see me. I crouched low, crawling toward the counter, and grabbed my phone. My hands were trembling as I unlocked it. But when I went to dial 911, I stopped. The footsteps had started again, louder now. I looked toward the front door. The porch light was on, casting a soft glow over the fresh snow. That's when I saw them. Footprints leading across the yard, up to the porch. My stomach dropped. There were no footprints leading away. The air felt too thick to breathe. Whoever had made those prints was still here. I turned off the flashlight, plunging myself into darkness, and crept toward the stairs. I needed to get back to my room, lock the door, and call for help. Halfway up, the knocking started. It was soft at first, just a light tap-tap on the door. I froze, clutching the railing so tightly my knuckles turned white. The knock came again, louder this time, tap-tap-tap. Then, a voice, low and hoarse, barely more than a whisper. I know you're in there. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't a neighbor or anyone I'd ever met. Panic surged through me. I ran up the stairs, slamming the door to my room and locking it. My hands fumbled as I dialed 911. The operator answered, calm and professional, but my words spilled out in a frantic rush. There's someone outside my house, I whispered. They're knocking on my door. Please, send someone. The operator asked for my address and assured me that help was on the way. Stay on the line. With me, she said, but before I could respond, I heard it again. The footsteps. But this time, they weren't outside. They were inside the house. I stared at my door, the phone pressed to my ear, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving down the hallway. I wanted to believe it wasn't real, that I was imagining it, but the sound was too clear, too distinct. They stopped right outside my door. Are you still there? The operator asked. Her voice seemed impossibly far away. Yes, I whispered. They're inside. The doorknob rattled. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I backed away, clutching the phone like a lifeline. The rattling stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the voice again, muffled through the door. Let me in. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Every muscle in my body was frozen. The voice came again, louder. This time, more insistent. Let me in. I shook my head, even though I knew they couldn't see me. The police are coming, I said. My voice trembling. You should leave. The silence that followed was worse than the voice. It stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, the sound of my shallow breathing. Then, a single word, spoken so softly I almost didn't hear it. Liar. The footsteps started again, retreating down the hallway. I stayed where I was, clutching the phone and listening as they descended the stairs. A new sound joined them, the creak of the front door opening. I didn't move until I heard sirens in the distance, growing louder as they approached. When the police arrived, they found the front door wide open. Snow had blown into the entryway, but there were no footprints leading away from the house, just the ones leading in. The officers searched the house and the surrounding area, but found nothing. No sign of forced entry. Maybe a neighbor playing a trick, but I knew better. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, set my nerves on edge. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I went outside to inspect the snow. Myself, the footprints were still there leading across the yard to my porch. But something was different. I followed them, my breath fogging in the cold morning air, until I reached the edge of the cestoy beside. There were no other houses, and I wondered if that was on purpose. Woods. The footprints didn't stop. They started. There, in the untouched snow, were two perfect prints, as if someone had dropped from the sky. It was one of the coldest mornings of the year. The frost on my bedroom window formed jagged patterns that looked almost like claw marks. I stepped outside. The snow in the backyard sparkled under the pale winter sun, untouched and pristine. At least, that's what I thought. Halfway across the yard, I noticed something strange. A lump in the snow near the tree line. At first, I thought it was just a drift or maybe a fallen branch buried by last night's storm. But as I got closer, I saw the edges of something dark poking out. Curiosity pulled me forward. I dropped the shovel and started brushing away the snow. The more I uncovered, the faster my heart raced. What I found wasn't a branch or debris. It was a hand. Pale, lifeless, frozen solid. I stumbled backward, the air freezing in my lungs. My brain tried to make sense of it. Was this some kind of sick prank? No, it felt too real. The hand was stiff, fingers curled slightly as if frozen mid-movement, then a shoulder, and finally, a face. It was a man, his skin tinged blue from the cold. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky. Ice had formed around his lips and nostrils. He wasn't dressed for the weather, just a thin jacket and jeans. No gloves, no hat. I bolted back to the house, my hands shaking as I fumbled with my phone to call the police. The receiver and posse took their usual positions. I raised my eyes from the messages. I must have looked easier said than done. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting the body to vanish, like some hallucination. But it didn't. It just lay there, motionless and eerily quiet. When the police arrived, the officers moved quickly, marking off the area with tape and asking me a flurry of questions. Had I seen anything unusual last night? Did I know the man? Had I heard any noises? No, I answered each time. I don't know him. I didn't hear anything. They examined the body, carefully removing it from the snow. Odd, from where he was found. It was as if he'd appeared out of nowhere. The lead officer noticed it too. His brow furrowed, and he exchanged a look with his partner. We'll need to do a full investigation, he said, but I could tell even he was unsettled. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The police said they'd run the man's fingerprints, but so far they hadn't identified him. No one had reported a missing person. Matching his description, the whole thing didn't make sense. Then, the dreams started. Every night, I saw him in my backyard. He wasn't lying in the snow anymore. He was standing at the edge of the tree line staring at my house. His blue-tinged skin glistened in the moonlight, and his frozen eyes seemed to follow me no matter where I moved. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, but the feeling of his gaze stayed with me. One night, I woke to a sound outside my window, a faint tapping, like knuckles against glass. My heart pounded as I turned toward the noise. There, on the other side of the frosty pane, was Weza, the man. Eyes bored into me, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Anger? Sadness? Desperation? I screamed and scrambled out of bed, but when I looked back, he was gone. The window was untouched. The police never found answers. They told me the man likely died somewhere else and his body was dumped in my yard, but they couldn't explain how or why. The case was eventually closed, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still here. Sometimes, I catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye when I'm near the tree line. Other times I hear faint tapping, like someone trying to get in. And on the coldest nights, I feel his frozen gaze watching me. It started with the wind, a low moaning sound that echoed through the trees, growing louder as the blizzard closed in. By the time the snow started falling heavily, I could barely see past the porch. The sky had turned a pale, eerie gray, and the world outside felt like it was being swallowed whole. I was staying alone in my family's old cabin, deep in the woods. It was supposed to be a weekend of solitude, a chance to clear my head. No phone calls, no emails. Just me, a roaring fire, and a good book. But as the storm worsened, the peaceful retreat I'd imagined turned into something else entirely. The power went out just before dusk, plunging the cabin into silence. I lit a few candles and stoked the fire, trying to ignore the growing unease creeping into my chest. The wind howled, louder now, rattling the windows and making the whole cabin shudder. I told myself it was just a storm, nothing to worry about. But then I saw the eyes. I was standing at the window, staring out at the swirling snow, when they appeared. Glowing orbs, faint but unmistakable, staring back at me from the darkness. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the way the snow reflected off the glass. But the eyes didn't move with the wind. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding. Who, or what, was out there? No one knew I was here. The cabin was miles from the nearest road, surrounded by dense forest. It wasn't possible for anyone to just wander in. I grabbed a flashlight and pointed it into the storm. The beam cut through the snow, but I couldn't see anything beyond the nearest trees. The eyes were gone, and for a moment, I let myself believe they had been my imagination, just shadows and snow playing tricks on me. But as I turned away, I heard it, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. I froze, my pulse racing. The sound was faint, but steady, coming from somewhere near the edge of the yard. Storm made it hard to see, but I thought I caught a glimpse of movement, something dark against the white, slipping between the trees. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. "Is someone out there?" The wind swallowed my words, carrying them into the night. I waited, straining to hear anything. Over the storm. Then, a low, guttural noise reached my ears, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal either. It was something else entirely. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. My flashlight beam flickered as I searched in the cabin for anything I could use to protect myself. The best I could find was a rusty fire poker, leaning against the hearth, not exactly reassuring, but it was better than nothing. The sound of footsteps grew louder, circling the cabin. My mind raced with possibilities. A bear? No, bears would be hibernating this time of year. A wolf, maybe. But wolves didn't have glowing eyes. The thought struck me like a lightning bolt. What if it's still watching me? Whether it's slowly, I turned toward the nearest window. At first, I saw nothing but swirling snow. But then, there they were, those eyes. Closer this time, brighter. They hovered just beyond the edge of the porch, staring at me through the glass. I stumbled backward, knocking over a candle. The flame sputtered and went out, plunging the room into deeper shadows. I didn't dare look away from the window. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't move. It was as if they were waiting for something. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The eyes vanished, swallowed by the storm. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the cabin door rattled on its hinges. I turned toward the sound, gripping the fire poker so tightly my knuckles ached. The door shook, again harder this time, as if something, or someone, was trying to force it open. I backed away, my chest tightening with panic. The old wooden door wouldn't hold for long. "Leave me alone," I screamed, my voice echoing through the empty cabin. The door stopped rattling. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the wind. I stood there, trembling, waiting for the next move. Then, I heard it, the unmistakable creak of someone walking in the living room beyond. Footsteps inside the cabin. I swung the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, but The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, coming closer. My throat tightened. The fire poker. I felt useless in my hands. "Who's there?" I whispered. The footsteps stopped. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow. A tall, hulking figure standing in the corner of the room. But when I pointed the light directly at it, there was nothing there. The wind roared outside, louder than ever, shaking the walls of the cabin. I turned back toward Jatara, the window, and my blood ran cold. The eyes were back, dozens of them. They hovered just beyond the glass, glowing like embers in the snow. They weren't all the same. Some were low to the ground, others towering above the porch. Wrote, as I realized they were surrounding the cabin, closing in. The doorknob rattled again, this time accompanied by a soft scratching sound, like claws, dragging against the wood. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering. The scratching grew, louder, more frantic, until it sounded like hundreds of claws tearing at the door and walls. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran, up the stairs into the small attic room where I used the screen to play as a child. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my chest heaving with panic. The sound of scratching and pounding filled the cabin below, shaking the floorboards. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. The wind still howled outside, but inside, everything was eerily quiet. I crept toward the attic window, hoping to see if the eyes were still out there. As I peered into the blizzard, my reflection stared back at me from the frosted glass. Moved, its lips curling into a twisted grin that wasn't mine. Behind it, faintly glowing in the dark storm, were the eyes. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving a pristine blanket of snow. When the search party arrived, they found the cabin empty. The doors were wide open, snow drifting inside, but there were no footprints leading to or from the property. Only a single message was scrawled on the frosty window, written in jagged, claw-like letters. "We see you." The snow was falling thick and heavy, muffling the world around me. I was out for an evening walk, the kind I always took when the stress of the day felt too much. The forest near my house. It was quiet and peaceful, a place where I could think. But that night, something felt off. At first I didn't notice the trail. The fresh snowfall had almost covered it. But as I reached a bend in the path, I saw it, a faint streak of red against the white. Blood. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the crimson trail. It cut through the snow like a scar, leading deeper into the woods. My first thought was that an animal might have been injured. A deer, maybe, or a fox. But the longer I looked at it, the more I realized it wasn't random. The trail wasn't scattered or chaotic like you'd expect from a wounded animal. It was a straight line, as if, well, something, or someone, had been dragged. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back. But curiosity was a powerful thing. I couldn't ignore the nagging thought in my mind, what if someone needs help? I followed the trail. The forest grew darker as I walked, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. The blood was fresher now, brighter, standing out starkly against the snow. It led me off the main path, into an area I'd never explored before. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Even the sound of the wind seemed to fade away, leaving only the crunch of my boots in the snow. I kept telling myself I'd turn around soon, that I was only checking to make sure everything was okay. But the further I went, the harder it was to stop. There was something about the trail, something that felt almost intentional, like it was leading me somewhere. The trees began to thin, and I found myself in a small clearing. At the center was a strange, jagged shape half buried in the snow. I approached cautiously, my breath visible in the cold air. Under the shadow of the tree, 7 figures moved. As I got closer, I realized what it was, a broken sled, splintered and smeared with blood. My stomach twisted. This wasn't an accident. Someone had been hurt, or worse. I looked around the clearing, my heart pounding. The trail didn't stop here. It continued on, leading into the darkness beyond the trees. I should have turned back. I knew that. But something about the trail pulled me forward, like an invisible thread I couldn't break. I pressed on, the snow crunching louder with every step. Then I heard it, a sound that froze me in place. A soft, wet noise, like something being dragged through the snow. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound was faint, but steady, coming from just ahead. I turned off my flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. The moonlight filtering through the trees was enough to see the trail, and I didn't want to risk being seen by whatever, or whoever, was out there. I crept forward, my footsteps as quiet as I could make them. The sound grew louder, clearer, wasn't just dragging. There was a low, guttural noise, like an animal growling, but it didn't sound natural. It was too deep, too rough, like the throat making it didn't quite belong to this world. I came to another clearing, this one larger. At the center, the trail of blood ended. My breath caught in my throat as I saw what lay there. A figure hunched over something in the snow. It was too dark to see clearly, but the shape was wrong. Its arms were long and thin, bent at strange angles. Its head twitched and jerked as it moved, making that awful growling noise. And beneath it was a body. I couldn't tell if the person was alive or dead. Blood pooled around them, staining the snow dark red. The creature tore at the body with sharp, deliberate movements, like it was feeding. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. I stood there, paralyzed, watching as the thing dragged its head up, its face, or what passed for a face, was covered in blood. Hollow. Eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, locking onto me. It saw me. The creature let out a low, bone-chilling growl and started to move toward me. Its body was wrong, too fast, too fluid, as if it wasn't bound by the same laws as everything else. My paralysis broke, and I turned and ran. The snow slowed me down, but I didn't dare look back. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the trees with unnatural speed. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they would give out, but I kept going. Somehow, I made it back to the main path. The forest seemed darker now, the trees closing in around me. I could still hear the creature, though it was further behind. I forced myself to keep running, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I finally burst out of the woods and into the open field near my house, the sound stopped. I turned back, my chest heaving, but there was nothing there. No eyes, no movement, just the quiet, snow-covered forest. I didn't sleep that night. I locked every door and window, sitting in the corner of my living room, with a kitchen knife in my hand. The image of the creature, its glowing eyes and bloodied face, was burned into my mind. The next morning I called the police. They found the sled, the trail of blood, and the clearing, where the body had been. But the body was gone. The snow was disturbed, as if something large had moved through, but there were no footprints, no tracks, just the blood and the broken sled. The officers told me it was probably a wild animal, maybe a bear, but I know what I saw. And sometimes late at night, I hear it again, that low, guttural growl, echoing through the woods, waiting, watching. It was supposed to be a simple hiking trip, a weekend away from work, away from the noise of Vitakit, the city. Just me, a trail map, and the quiet of the forest. I packed light, carried my GPS, and I made sure to stick to the marked paths. I didn't want to get lost. But something about the woods that day felt wrong. The air was heavy, colder than it should have been for late spring. The trees were unnaturally still, their branches hanging like frozen fingers. The sound of birds and insects, so familiar in the forest, had disappeared entirely. The silence pressed against my ears, making me hyper-aware of every crunch of my boots on the dirt. By late afternoon, I realized I'd taken a wrong turn. The map didn't match the trail anymore, and my GPS had stopped working. It showed my location as a blank screen, as if I'd stepped off the edge of the world. I told myself to stay calm. I had plenty of supplies, and I'd find my way back to the main trail before dark. That's when I saw it. Through the thick trees, a small building emerged, its dark outline barely visible against the fading light. build something so far from the main trail. But there it was, nestled in a clearing like it had been, waiting for me. The cabin looked old. Its wooden walls were weathered and gray, the roof sagging under the weight of moss and time. Trees. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, unsure if I should approach. But the sun was dipping low, and the thought of spending the night lost in the woods wasn't appealing. I stepped closer, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" No answer. The silence seemed to deepen, as if the forest was holding its breath. The cabin door creaked open at the slightest touch, revealing a dim interior. Dust motes floated in the pale light streaming through the cracked windows. Wooden table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace with a stack of logs that looked untouched. It felt abandoned, but not entirely forgotten. I stepped inside, my boots echoing on the wooden floor. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of old wood and something else, something faint and metallic, like rust or blood. I told myself I was imagining things. The place was empty, safe. I'd spend the night here then, figure out my way back in the morning. As I explored, I noticed strange details. The table had deep scratches carved into its surface, almost like claw marks. I kicked it in anger. On the walls hung faded photographs, their images too blurred to make out. But the worst was the mirror above the fireplace. It wasn't dusty like everything else. The glass was clean, almost too clean, and when I looked into it, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My reflection was wrong. It looked like me, but staring back seemed off. The eyes were too wide, the smile too sharp. I stepped away, my heart pounding. That's when I heard it, a soft creak from upstairs. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, louder this time, like a footstep on the floorboards above. My mind raced. Could someone else be here? I'd called out before and heard nothing. Maybe they'd been hiding. "Hello?" I called again, my voice shaking. No reply. I grabbed a broken chair leg from the floor and made my way up the narrow staircase. Each step groaned under my weight, the sound echoing in the empty cabin. The second floor was small, just a single room, with a bed pushed against the far wall. The mattress was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, draped the corners like curtains. But the window was open. A cold breeze blew in, carrying the faint scent of decay. I walked over to close it and noticed something strange. The ground outside was undisturbed. No footprints. No sign that anyone had climbed in or out. I shut the window, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the wall by the bed. Words, scratched deep into the wood, overlapping and chaotic, as if they'd been written in a frenzy. "Leave, it ceased to you." I stumbled back, the chair legs slipping from my hands and hitting the floor with a loud crack. The sound seemed to echo longer than it should have, reverberating through the cabin. I didn't wait to find out what it meant. I bolted down the stairs, ready to leave and take my chances with the woods. But when I reached the front door, it was closed. I was sure I'd left it open. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, but before I could turn it, I heard another noise. A deep, guttural sound, like breathing coming from just behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The breathing grew louder, closer, filling my ears. My reflection in the mirror caught my eye again, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't me. The figure in the mirror grinned, its head tilting unnaturally to the side. Its eyes glowed faintly, the dim light, and as I stared, frozen with fear, it raised a hand and pointed to the window. I turned, my heart racing, and saw it. Outside, just beyond the clearing, a shadow moved between the trees, tall, impossibly thin, with glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. It didn't move like a person. It glided, silent and smooth, as if it were floating just above the ground. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I yanked the door open and ran, the cold air biting at my face as I sprinted into the woods. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound of branches snapping and snow crunching behind me told me it was following. Somehow, I found the main trail. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I kept running until I saw the familiar glow of my car's headlights in the distance. I jumped inside, locking the doors and fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped away without looking back. When I got home, I pulled out the map and searched for the clearing where I'd found the cabin. It wasn't there. No trails led to it, no markings to indicate it existed. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about that cabin. I see its dark windows and hear the breathing behind me. And when I wake up, the words carved into the wall echo in my mind. Leave. It seized you. It started with a sharp burning pain in my fingers, the kind of pain that makes you instinctively curl your hands into fists, hoping the sensation will go away. But it didn't. It only grew worse, spreading to my toes, my nose, my ears. I woke up in the middle of the night, gasping, my breath visible in the air like tiny clouds. The room was freezing. At first, I thought the heat must have gone out. It was the middle of winter, and the old boiler in my apartment had failed before. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but my fingers wouldn't cooperate. They were stiff, numb at the tips, and I realized with growing alarm that they looked pale, almost bluish. I sat up in bed, pulling the covers closer around me. My toes felt the same, frozen, unresponsive. My breath quickened as I touched my face. My nose felt hard, like it had been, dipped in ice water, and my ears stung with the same sharp burn. How could this happen? I hadn't left my bed. I hadn't even opened the window. The room wasn't just cold, it was wrong. The air felt heavy, and the shadows seemed darker than they should have been. My bedside clock glowed faintly, the red numbers reading 3:12 a.m. I tried to convince myself it was just the cold playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew. Something was off. I reached for the blanket to wrap myself tighter, but the fabric felt damp. My stomach twisted. As I realized the sheets were coated in a thin layer of frost, I rubbed my hands together, trying to warm them, but it was useless. The frost seemed to cling to my skin, almost like it was spreading. A sound broke the silence, a soft creak, like a floorboard settling under weight. My heart jumped. I wasn't alone. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, louder this time, from the corner of the room. Slowly, I turned my head toward the noise. The shadows in the corner shifted, darker and deeper than the rest of the room. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw it. Eyes. Two faintly glowing orbs staring at me. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They didn't move. They just watched. My throat tightened, and my breath came in short, shallow bursts. The cold seemed to intensify, wrapping around me like a suffocating embrace. I wanted to scream, to bolt out of bed and run, but even as my lungs constricted, but my body wouldn't obey. My limbs felt heavy, as if the frost had seeped into my muscles, locking me in place. The eyes blinked. I clutched the edge of the blanket, my fingers trembling. The thing in the corner shifted, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was thin, almost skeletal, with limbs that stretched too long and too sharp. It moved closer, dragging itself forward with unnatural, jerky movements. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice cracking. The thing didn't answer. It stopped at the foot of my bed, its head tilting unnaturally to the side. The glowing eyes studied me, unblinking. I couldn't see its face, only the faint outline of a mouth that seemed too wide, too full of jagged, uneven teeth. My breath hitched as the air around me grew even colder. Frost spread across the bed frame, creeping toward me like it was alive. The creature's bony hand reached out, its long fingers stretching impossibly far. I tried to pull back, but my body was frozen. Whether from fear or the cold, I couldn't tell. His fingers brushed my foot. The pain was instant and excruciating, like shards of ice slicing into my skin. I bit back a scream, my vision blurring with tears. The creature pulled its hand back, and for a moment, I thought it would leave. But then it crawled onto the bed. The mattress sagged under its weight, though it looked far too thin to be heavy. The frost followed it, spreading rapidly, covering the blankets and pillows. I could see my breath in frantic puffs, and my chest felt tight. as if the cold was squeezing the life out of me. The creature leaned closer, its face inches from mine. Its breath was colder than the air around us, and it reeked of decay. I tried to turn my head away, but its hand shot out, gripping my jaw. With impossible strength, its fingers were like ice, burning my skin. It opened its mouth, revealing those horrible teeth, and whispered, in a voice that sounded like wind howling through cracks in a wall, "You're mine now." The words echoed in my skull, louder than they should have been, drowning out every other sound. My vision darkened, the room spinning around me. I tried to fight it, to claw my way free. The cold was too strong. My eyelids grew heavy, and I felt myself slipping into unconsciousness. Safe? When I woke up, sunlight streamed through the window. The frost was gone, and the room was warm again, almost uncomfortably so. For a brief moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But then I looked at my hands. The tips of my fingers were blackened, the skin cracked and peeling. My toes were the same, and my ears stung with a dull, throbbing pain. I touched my face and felt the blistered, hardened skin of frostbite. I never left my bed. I never went outside. And yet, here I was, injured in a way that should have. Why, this was it. I was done. This was going to be impossible. The memory of the creature flashed in my mind. Its eyes, its teeth, its voice. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. I felt the cold. I heard its whisper. That night, I slept with the lights on, clutching my blankets tightly around me. But the cold came back. It always does. And when it does, I feel the frost creeping closer, spreading faster, like it's trying to claim me for good. I know it's still out there, watching, waiting, and one day, I won't wake up at all. It started on one of the coldest nights I could remember. The wind howled outside my window, rattling the glass like it was desperate to get in. The temperature had dropped so low that frost had crept inside, forming delicate, icy patterns along the edges of my mirror. I'd pulled my blanket tighter around me, but the chill seeped through, clinging to my skin. I couldn't sleep. Something about the night felt off, the kind that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Even the usual creaks of the old house seemed to have stopped, as if it was holding its breath. I tried to shake the feeling and exhaled a deep breath into the room. That's when I saw it. My breath, visible in the freezing air, didn't fade like it should have. Instead, it hovered there, activating my instincts to respond by throwing up on the spot. I drained it clean by the time I accessed the computer for its scan, hanging in front of me in pale, misty tendrils. I stared, my mind scrambling to make sense of it. Then, slowly, the mist began to shift, swirling and condensing until it formed shapes. Letters. Help. The word hung in the air, clear and sharp, before dissolving into nothing. I blinked, my heart pounding. I told myself it was a trick of the cold, some strange quirk of physics. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I tried again, breathing out another puff of air. This time, it didn't wait to fade. The mist twisted and curled, almost as if an invisible hand were guiding it. More letters appeared. It's here. My chest tightened. I scanned the room, my eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. The glow of my bedside lamp barely reached the walls, leaving long, dark spaces where anything. "Who's here?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. I didn't expect an answer, but when I exhaled again, the mist formed one more word. ND. Panic gripped me. My breath came faster, each exhale turning into a frantic plea written in the Dalles. Air. Run. 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 The letters melted away as quickly as they appeared, but the message was clear. I didn't need to be told again. I threw back the covers and bolted for the door. The cold bit at my skin, and the floor felt like ice beneath my bare feet. I didn't stop to grab my phone or put on shoes. I just needed to get out. As I reached the hallway, the temperature seemed to drop even further. My breath fogged the air. With every step, and the mist lingered longer now, twisting and writhing on its own, began to form around me, scrawled in the cold like invisible whispers brought to life. Don't look. Too late. Behind you. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The air behind me felt heavy, pressing against my back, like a physical weight, moving, to listen to the words and run, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned my head. The hallway stretched into darkness, empty and still. For a moment I thought I was safe, but then I saw it, split in the shadows. Its outline was barely visible, but its eyes glowed faintly, too. Pinpricks of pale light that pierced the dark. It didn't move, it didn't have to. The air around it seemed alive, swirling and pulsing with frost and mist, cold that seemed to seep into my very bones. The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing, as if it were studying me. Then, without warning, it stepped forward. I ran. The hallway stretched endlessly, each step feeling slower than the last. My breaths came in frantic bursts, and with each exhale, the air around me filled with new words. Finally, he let me go. It's coming. You can't escape. The last one made me stumble. My foot caught on the edge of a rug, and I hit the floor hard, the impact jarring me back to my senses. I scrambled to my feet, refusing to look back, and finally reached the staircase. The air was so cold now that every breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. But I didn't stop. I reached the front door and yanked it open, expecting to feel the rush of icy wind from outside. But instead, the air was still. The snow-covered street beyond was quiet, untouched. I stepped outside, the cold biting at my skin, and slammed the door behind me. For a moment I thought I was safe. My breath came slower, visible in the frigid night air. But as I turned to head down the driveway, I saw them again, the words, forming in the mist of my breath. It's not over. The chill in the air deepened, and a shadow stretched across the snow. Slowly I turned to see the Kilior. Kilior! A figure standing on the porch, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. Frost spread from its feet, crawling toward me across the ground. The words formed again, hanging in the frozen air around. The sound became a trance. I moved, filled with something. Yeah, you brought it here. My heart sank. The realization hit me like a wave of ice. Whatever it was, I hadn't escaped it. I let it out of the house, into the world. And now, it wasn't going to stop. I ran, leaving the house behind, but I could still feel the cold following me. The words swirled around me in the air, taunting me, guiding me, whispering promises I didn't want to hear. I don't know how long I ran, I don't know where I ended up. All I know is that the cold never left. It's inside me now, spreading slowly, taking over, and every time I breathe, I see the words. They're always there, frozen in the air, waiting to tell me what comes next. The storm hit harder than anyone expected. By the time I realized how bad it was too late to leave. The wind howled outside like a living thing, shaking the small cabin to its foundations. Snow piled high against the windows, blocking out what little light the overcast sky offered. I was completely cut off. At first I told myself it would be fine. I had enough food and firewood to last a couple of days, and the storm would pass soon. It was just me and the snow, nothing to worry about. But as the hours dragged on, a strange unease settled over me. The cabin, so cozy when I'd first arrived, felt different now, claustrophobic, almost alive. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind, sounded like a whisper just out of earshot. Night fell quickly, turning the cabin into a small island in a sea of darkness. I lit a few candles and sat near the fireplace, trying to focus on the book I'd brought. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It started with small things. A faint scratching at the door, too soft to be the wind. A shadow, flickering in the corner of my vision, gone before I could turn my head. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me. The isolation, my imagination, was something fresh. But then, 3 slow, deliberate knocks echoed through the cabin, cutting through the sound of the wind. My stomach dropped. No one could possibly be out there, not in this storm. The snow was so deep it reached the windows. Even if someone had been out there, they wouldn't have made it this far. Hello? I called, my voice shaking. Is someone there? No answer, just the wind and the crackle of the fire. I stayed frozen in place, staring at the door. Minutes passed. but the knocking didn't come again. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. A tree branch maybe, or the wind slamming loose snow against the wood. But I couldn't ignore the feeling crawling up my spine. Something was out there. I moved to the window and wiped away the frost with my sleeve. The snow outside was an unbroken white, untouched by any footprints. The storm had buried everything in a thick, suffocating blanket, just barely visible in the swirling snow. It stood motionless, too far away to make out details, but I could feel its eyes on me. I backed away from the window, my breath quick and shallow. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat prickling my skin, despite the heat from the fire. I turned back to the door, half expecting it to burst open, but it remained closed, locked, the bolts in place. For hours, I sat by the fire, clutching a fire poker like it would do any good. The storm outside raged on, and every sound made me jump. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. I woke up to silence. The storm had stopped, the wind no longer howled, and the cabin was eerily quiet. I sat up, shivering, trying to shake the grogginess. That's when I noticed the footprints. They started at the door and led across the room, stopping right next to the chair where I'd been. Sleeping, weren't human. I shot to my feet, the fire poker still clutched in my hand. My breath came in shallow gasps, visible in the freezing air. The cabin was still locked, the windows were shut. Whatever had made those footprints, it was still here. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. No response. Just the creak of the wood and the faint sound of melting snow dripping from the roof. In the far corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the dim firelight, something crouched. Its form was hunched, its limbs too long and thin to belong to any person. Its eyes glinted faintly in the darkness, unblinking. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. My grip on the fire poker tightened. "Get out," I said, though my voice was barely more than a whisper. The thing tilted its head, as if it didn't understand. Then it moved. Slowly, it rose to its full height, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. My knees went weak as it took a step forward. The fire flickered, casting fleeting light over its face, or what should have been its face. The f***ing cried, "Call to call." Skin was pale and stretched too tight over its skull. Its mouth was a jagged slit filled with teeth. That looked too sharp, too numerous. But its eyes were the worst. Empty and black, but somehow full of a terrible hunger. I stumbled back, tripping over the chair. The fire poker fell from my hands, clattering to the floor. The thing didn't react. It just kept moving, slow and deliberate, until it was standing over me. I braced myself, waiting for it to strike, but it didn't. Instead, it knelt down, its face inches from mine. Its breath was cold, colder than the snow outside, and it reeked of decay. Then it whispered, its voice like ice cracking on a frozen lake. "You let me in." My mind reeled. What did it mean? I hadn't let anyone in. I'd kept the door locked, the windows shut. But then I remembered the knocking, the faint scratching, the shadow I'd seen in the corner of my vision. It had been here all along. Before I could react, it lunged. The cold enveloped me, piercing my skin like needles. The last thing I saw before everything went black was its mouth, stretching impossibly wide, and those eyes, devouring everything they touched. I woke up hours later, lying on the floor. The cabin was empty, the fire long dead. The snow outside had started again, and the footprints leading from the door were gone. But I wasn't alone. Even now as I write this, I feel its presence. In the corner of the room, in the shadows behind me, in the silence that grows louder with each passing second. It's still here, waiting. And this time, it won't let me go. The wind that night was relentless. It screamed through the trees, rattling the windows of my tiny cabin deep in the woods. I'd come out here to get away from the city, to find some peace and quiet. The fireplace crackled weakly, struggling against the draft that slipped through every crack in the old wooden walls. I sat on the couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, trying to read, but I couldn't focus. The howling wind outside sounded like it was alive, angry, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it. At first I thought it was just the wind, a low, almost melodic sound weaving through the trees. But as I strained to listen, I realized it wasn't random. It was a voice. Soft, faint, but unmistakably human. I froze, my heart pounding. Nearest road, and the storm had made the dirt path leading to it impossible to navigate. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But then it came again. Come outside. The words were barely audible, carried on the wind like a secret meant only for me. My breath caught in my throat. I stood and moved to the window, peering into the darkness. Snow swirled wildly outside, making it hard to see more than a few feet. But there, just at the edge of the trees, I thought I saw movement, a shadow, too tall and too still to be a trick of the storm. I stepped back from the window, my pulse racing. The fire cast flickering shadows across the room, and for a moment, they seemed to move on their own, twisting and stretching toward me. Sleep, shook my head, trying to snap myself out of it. I was just spooked, that was all. The isolation, the storm, it was messing with my head. But then the voice came again, louder this time. Please, come outside. It sounded closer now, like whoever or whatever was speaking was just outside the door. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and moved toward the door, my hands trembling. I didn't want to open it, but I had to know. I had to see. The old wooden door creaked as I pulled it open, and a blast of icy wind hit me, making me stumble back. The snow whipped around me, blinding and deafening. I shone the flashlight into a storm, but the beam barely cut through the swirling white. Hello? I called out, my voice shaking. Who's there? Silence. Pounding, before stepping back inside and slamming the door. I locked it, leaning against the wood, trying to catch my breath. Then I heard it again. Ozer. This time, it came from the other side of the cabin. My stomach dropped. Whoever was out there had moved. Fast. Too fast. I turned off the flashlight, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the weak light of the fire. My breath fogged in the freezing air as I crept to the opposite window. The snow outside was as wild as ever, but I saw them now. Footprints leading away from the door, circling the haven. The voice came again, so close it felt like it was right next to my ear. Let me in. I spun around, my back pressed to the wall. The shadows seemed to shift, stretching toward me, like grasping hands. I clutched the flashlight, my knuckles white, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to see what might be waiting for me in the dark. The voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. Open the door. No, I shouted, my voice cracking. Leave me alone. The cabin fell silent. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then, the pounding started. Heavy, rhythmic blows against the door, shaking it in its frame. The fire flickered violently, and the wind outside roared as if the storm itself was angry. I backed into the corner, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. My breath came in short, panicked bursts. The pounding grew louder, more violent, until I was sure the door would. Then it stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. I stayed frozen in the corner, too afraid to move, my ears straining for any sound. Slowly, I crept toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Nothing. I exhaled a shaky breath and stepped back. But as I turned, I saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the room, tall and thin, its features hidden in the shadows. Its presence filled the cabin with a suffocating cold, and the air seemed to hum with an unnatural hum. Energy. It wasn't human. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over a gaunt, elongated frame. Its eyes were empty, black pits, and its mouth curved into a smile that was far too wide. It took a step toward me, its movements unnaturally fluid, like it was gliding instead of walking. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. "What do you want?" I screamed. It tilted its head, that terrible smile widening. When it spoke, its voice was the same whisper I'd heard in the wind, but now it was deafening, echoing inside my skull. You let me in. My back hit the wall, and I slid to the floor, my body trembling. The thing crouched in front of me, its face inches from mine. Its breath was cold, like the wind outside, and it reeked of decay. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. You shouldn't have listened, it whispered. The world went black. When I woke up, the cabin was empty. The fire was out, and the storm had passed. The snow outside was untouched, and there were no footprints. Not mine, not anyone else's. It was as if nothing had happened, but I can still hear the voice. Every time the wind howls, it whispers my name. Waiting. It started in a tiny antique shop tucked away at the edge of town. The place was crammed with dusty shelves and cluttered tables, filled with strange items that looked like they'd been forgotten by time. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just killing time on a cold, gray afternoon. That's when I saw it. The snow globe was on a low shelf, almost hidden behind a stack of faded books. It wasn't anything special at first glance. A small glass dome with a wooden base, the kind you'd find at a souvenir shop. Inside was a tiny cabin surrounded by pine trees, all covered in a delicate blanket of snow. Something about it drew me in. When I picked it up, the shopkeeper appeared almost instantly. He was an older man, thin and pale, with watery gray eyes that seemed to look through me. That one's unique, he said, his voice low and gravelly. Not for everyone. What do you mean? I asked, turning the globe in my hands. He hesitated, then smiled faintly. It's said to show more than just snow. Some claim it shows the future. I laughed nervously, assuming he was joking, but when he didn't laugh with me, the air grew heavy. About it felt important, like it was meant for me. When I got home, I placed the snow globe on my desk. The tiny cabin inside was perfect, down to the smallest detail. The windows had little curtains, and the snow on the trees glistened as if it were real. I gave it a shake, watching the flakes swirl around inside. It was oddly calming, almost hypnotic. That night, I dreamed of the cabin. It was exactly like the one in the snow globe, down to the crooked chimney and the narrow path leading to the front door. The dream felt vivid, too real to be just a dream. I could feel the crunch of snow under my boots, the icy wind biting at my skin. When I reached the door, I hesitated, a sense of dread washing over me. But before I could open it, I woke up. The snow globe was still on my desk, undisturbed. But when I picked it up, something was different. The cabin inside wasn't the same anymore. The windows were dark, and smoke curled from the chimney, like someone was inside. I stared at it, my heart racing. I hadn't noticed those details before. Maybe I just hadn't been, I can't read, paying attention. I shook it again, hoping the swirling snow would hide the eerie details. But when the flakes settled, the scene had shifted even more. A figure stood in the doorway of the cabin. Small, shadowy, and faceless, but unmistakably there. I dropped the globe, my breath catching in my throat. It didn't shatter. Instead, it landed softly on the carpet, rolling to a stop as if mocking me. I didn't touch it again that day. That night, the dream returned. This time, I wasn't outside the cabin. I was inside. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering lantern on the table. The walls were lined with shelves, all filled with old, dusty snow globes. Each one was slightly different, showing scenes of forests, towns, and empty streets. I turned toward the window and froze. Outside, in the swirling snow, a figure stood at the edge of the trees. It was the same one from the globe, tall, shadowy, and still. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me. I woke up drenched in sweat, the image burned into my mind. The snow globe on my desk had changed again. The figure was closer now, standing in the middle of the snowy path leading to the cabin. I wanted to throw it away, to smash it into 1,000 pieces, but I couldn't. Some part of me needed to know what would happen next. Over the next few days, the dreams grew worse. Each time I found myself back in the cabin, the figure outside moving closer and closer. The snow globe mirrored the dreams perfectly, its tiny figure inching forward with each passing night. I stopped sleeping. The sight of the globe filled me with dread, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. was no longer just a cabin. It was my house. The same windows, the same front porch, even the same old mailbox with its peeling paint. My stomach churned as I stared at it. The figure in the snow was standing at the edge of the property, now its shadow stretching toward the door. That night, I locked every door and window in my house. I left every light on and sat in the shallowest living room, clutching a kitchen knife. The snow globe sat on the coffee table in front of me, its tiny flakes swirling in slow, deliberate circles. The figure was at the porch now, one hand reaching for the door. I didn't dream that night. I didn't sleep at all. But when I blinked, just for a second, the sound of knocking echoed through the house. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I held my breath, my eyes glued to the snow globe. Inside, the scene had changed again. The figure wasn't outside anymore. It was inside the cabin, standing in the middle of the room, my living room. The lights around me flickered. The air grew colder, and my breath fogged in the chill. I didn't dare move. I couldn't. The figure inside turned its head to look at me. The knocking started again, louder this time, and then it stopped. The snow globe still sits on my desk, its scene unchanged. The figure is gone now, but the cabin is still there, its windows dark and its door slightly ajar. I keep it covered with a cloth, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the faint sound of snowflakes swirling inside, and I know it's not over. The snowstorm hit faster than I expected. By the time I realized how bad it was, the winding mountain road I was driving on had disappeared under a thick blanket of white. My car's tires spun uselessly as the engine sputtered, and I knew I wasn't going anywhere. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. Not surprising, given how remote the area was. My only option was to wait out the storm. That's when I saw it. Faint, flickering lights in the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow. A town. Relief washed over me. I grabbed my bag, pulled my coat tight, and started walking toward the telestic lights. Shelter. When I reached the edge of the town, something felt off. The place was eerily quiet, as if the storm had muffled every sound. The buildings were old, their wooden walls weathered and sagging under the weight of the snow. The lights I'd seen weren't electric. They were lanterns, glowing faintly in the windows of the darkened homes and businesses. It didn't make sense. No one lived here. I remembered reading about this town in a guidebook. It had been abandoned decades ago, a mining community left to rot after the gold dried up. Yet the lanterns burned, steady and inviting, like they'd been waiting for me. I hesitated, but the cold forced my decision. I picked the closest building, a small inn with a crooked sign swinging in the wind, and pushed open the door. The inside was surprisingly warm, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows all across the ceiling, shadows on the walls. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I set my bag down and approached the fire, rubbing my hands together to warm them. The room was empty, but it felt lived in. A teapot sat on a nearby table, steam curling from its spout. Plates and cups were laid out as if someone had been in the middle of a meal. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something about this wasn't right. I should have left. I should have braved the storm and gone back to my car. But the warmth of the fire was too inviting, and my exhaustion too great. I decided to stay the night. I found a small room upstairs with a bed that looked surprisingly clean. The window overlooked the main street, and I could see more lanterns glowing faintly in the snow-covered buildings. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow crossing in front of one of the windows. But when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was just the wind, the flickering of the lanterns playing tricks on my eyes. I locked the door and climbed into bed, pulling the heavy blankets up to my chin. The mattress was lumpy, but it was better than freezing to death in my car. I don't know how long I slept, but something woke me in the middle of the night. A sound. At first I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Footsteps. Slow and heavy, creaking on the wooden floorboards. They echoed down the hallway, growing louder with each step. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay perfectly still, my breath shallow. The footsteps stopped, just outside my door. I stared at the doorknob, half expecting it to turn, but it didn't move. Minutes passed, then hours, or at least it felt that way. Eventually, the sound faded, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up, pale morning light filtered through the frosted window. The storm had stopped, leaving the town buried under a fresh layer of snow. For a brief moment, I convinced myself the night before had been a dream. But when I opened the door, I saw them. Footprints. Large, heavy prints leading from my door down the hallway and disappearing into the staircase. My stomach twisted. I followed them cautiously, my pulse racing. They led to the front door of the inn, which hung open slightly, snow drifting in from outside. I stepped into the street, the cold biting at my skin. The town looked different in the daylight. Desolate, abandoned, as if no one had been here in decades. The lanterns were gone, the windows dark, but the footprints continued, leading toward the center of town. I followed them. The prints stopped abruptly in front of the old church. Its doors were wide open, revealing a dark interior that seemed to swallow the sunlight. Something inside me screamed to turn back, to run, but I couldn't. I stepped inside. The air was freezing, and the faint scent of decay hung in the stillness. The church was empty, the pews coated in dust and cobwebs. But at the front of the room, where the altar should have been, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its back to me, draped in tattered black cloth that seemed to shift and writhe, like smoke. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, a heavy, oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. I tried to step back, but the floor creaked under my weight. The figure turned. Its face was hollow, empty, like the snow had carved away any features it might have had. Black, empty sockets stared at me, and its mouth stretched into a jagged grin. It didn't speak, but I heard it, a low, guttural whisper that echoed in my mind. You shouldn't have stayed. The lanterns outside flared to life, their light spilling into the church. Shadows twisted and writhed, crawling up the walls, reaching for me. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car. The snow had melted from the tires, the engine roaring too. Life as if it had never been stuck. I drove away without looking back, the town vanishing in my rearview mirror. When I got home, I told myself it was over. But every night since, I've dreamed of that town. The lanterns, window, I hear the whisper again. You shouldn't have stayed. It was supposed to be a quick walk. The air was cold, yes, but I'd been outside plenty of times in winter. That day didn't seem any different. I was bundled up, gloves, scarf, a heavy coat. You didn't think twice about stepping outside to get some fresh air. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I wandered down the empty street. The town was quiet, most people staying indoors to avoid the cold snap that had rolled in overnight. The temperature had dropped fast, but I didn't think it was anything unusual. I liked the cold. It cleared my mind. Then the wind changed. It wasn't like any wind I'd felt before. It came from nowhere, sudden and sharp, cutting through my layers as if they weren't there. My scarf was ripped from my face, and the chill hit me full force. I tried to pull my scarf back up, but my fingers wouldn't move. I looked down at my hands and froze. Fingers were pale, almost blue, the tips already darkening to a sickly gray. Panic set in. This wasn't normal. It hadn't been more than a few seconds, but my hands looked like they'd been exposed to freezing temperatures for hours. The air so cold it burned my throat. This time, my ears rang with a low, howling sound that seemed almost human. I stumbled, my vision blurring. My feet felt numb, and when I tried to move, it was like dragging. Dead weight. I had to get inside. I had to find warmth. Somehow, I managed to reach my front door, fumbling with the handle until it swung open. I collapsed inside, slamming the door shut. Behind me, the warmth of the house didn't help. My hands felt like they were on fire, the pain unbearable as the blood struggled to return to my frozen skin. My face burned too, and when I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, I almost didn't recognize what I saw. My cheeks and nose were pale, frostbitten, with patches of gray creeping across the surface. Lips were cracked and blue, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I grabbed my phone, with shaking hands, and dialed for help. When I arrived at the hospital, the nurse who greeted me took one look at my hands and face and called for the doctor. They didn't ask what had happened, didn't seem surprised at all by the state I was in. That was the first thing that struck me as odd. The doctor arrived quickly, A tall, thin man with sharp features and tired eyes. He didn't look alarmed or confused, just resigned. "This isn't unusual," he said, examining my hands. His voice was calm, almost detached. "We've seen this before." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I was only outside for a minute. How could this happen?" The doctor glanced at the nurse, who gave him a subtle nod. He sighed and leaned closer, lowering his voice. "It's not the cold," he said. "Not entirely." I stared at him, confused. "Then what is it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he unrolled a bandage and began wrapping my hands. "Have you heard of the cold whisper?" The name sent a shiver down my spine, though I didn't know why. "No," I said. "What is that?" "It's what we call the wind that hit you," he explained. "It's not natural. It comes during the coldest snaps, targeting people who wander too far alone. It's selective?" I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "Not everyone feels it, but those who do, they're marked." "Marked for what?" I asked, my stomach twisting. He hesitated, then leaned in closer, his voice dropping even lower. "For something ancient. Something that's been here longer than we have. The whisper isn't just wind. It's alive, and it doesn't let go." I felt my chest tighten. "That's ridiculous," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "It's just frostbite, right?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, his expression grim. "Stay indoors," he said finally. "Keep warm, and if you hear it again, don't go outside." She smiled. I wanted to argue, to demand a better explanation, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It wasn't fear. It was something worse. Resignation. When I got home, I tried to forget what he'd said. I told myself it was just an old myth, a story, meant to scare people, but the pain in my hands and face wouldn't let me forget. The frostbite didn't fade like it should have. The gray patches remained, spreading slowly, no matter how many treatments I tried. And then the dream started. Every night, I found myself back in the storm, standing in the middle of the empty street. The wind howled around me, carrying voices, soft, insistent whispers that I couldn't quite understand. And always I'd wake up freezing, my breath visible in the air, even though the room was warm. The next time I heard the wind, I was awake. It came late at night, rattling the windows and sending a chill through the house. At first I thought it was just a normal storm, but then I heard it, the whispering, low, guttural voices, calling my name, urging me to come outside. I stayed in bed, clutching the blankets tightly around me, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like they were inside the house. I couldn't breathe. The air was so cold it burned my lungs. When I finally worked up the courage to look out the window, my blood ran cold. Something was out there. In the middle of the snow-covered street stood a figure, tall and thin, its form barely visible through the swirling wind. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, and though I couldn't see its face, I could feel its eyes on me. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, filling my ears until I couldn't think. The figure raised a hand, beckoning. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but when I blinked, it was gone. The wind stopped, leaving only silence in its wake. The frostbite never healed. The gray patches continued to spread, slowly but surely, as if the cold had buried itself deep inside me. I've stopped going outside, stopped opening the windows, but it doesn't matter. The whispers are still there, and one day, I won't be able to resist them. It started on the coldest morning of the year, the kind of cold that freezes the air in your lungs and turns every surface into glass. My car was buried under a thick layer of snow, and icicles hung from the edges of the roof like jagged teeth. I was halfway through clearing the driveway when I noticed something unusual. One of the icicles hanging from the gutter looked different. It was longer than the others, thicker, and there was something inside it. At first, I thought it was just a clump of leaves or debris frozen in the ice, but as I stepped closer, my breath fogging in the icy air, I saw it more clearly. It was a key. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks. It was old and rusted, its intricate design unlike any key I'd ever seen. Twisting patterns wrapped around the shaft, and the head of the key was shaped like an open eye. It looked like it belonged to another time, another world. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a hammer from the garage and carefully chipped away at the icicle until the key fell into my gloved hand. It was colder than I expected, the chill biting, even through the thick fabric. As I held it, a strange sensation washed over me. Like the key was, I wailed, the key humming softly, vibrating against my palm. I should have left it there. I should have thrown it away. But something about it felt important, like it had been waiting for me. I brought it inside, letting it thaw on the kitchen counter. As the ice melted, the patterns on the key became clearer, more detailed. The open eye seemed almost alive, its intricate carvings glinting in the dim light. I turned it over in my hands, wondering what it could unlock. That night, the dream started. I was standing in the middle of an endless frozen field, snow stretching as far as the eye could see. The wind howled around me, and in the distance, I could see a tall, dark door standing alone in the snow. It didn't belong there. Its heavy wooden frame looked ancient, out of place in the barren landscape. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. But what unsettled me the most wasn't the dream. It was the key, sitting on my nightstand, even though I was sure I'd left it in the kitchen. The next day I couldn't stop thinking about the door, the way it seemed to call to me, its surface, covered in the same twisting patterns as the key. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the image lingered, etched into my thoughts like a splinter I couldn't remove. By evening I made a decision. I had to know. I bundled up and stepped outside, holding the key tightly in my hand. The air was unnaturally still, the snow crunching under my boots as I wandered aimlessly. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe I was hoping for the dream that would guide me, that I'd stumble upon the door like some forgotten relic buried in the snow. And then, I saw it. It stood at the edge of the woods, exactly like in my dream. The tall, dark door loomed over me, its surface glinting faintly in the moonlight. The patterns on the wood seemed to shift and writhe, as if they were alive, and the cold around it was deeper, sharper, like the air itself was afraid to come near. I should have turned back. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to throw the key into the snow and run, but I couldn't. The door was calling to me, pulling me closer with an invisible force. I reached out with trembling hands and fit the key into the lock. It turned easily, the sound of the mechanism echoing like thunder in the stillness. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but Edvardurvik, darkness beyond. For a moment I hesitated. Then, as if pushed by an unseen hand, I stepped through. The cold hit me first, an unbearable, bone-deep chill that stole the air from my lungs. The ground beneath my feet felt wrong, soft and brittle, like it could crumble at any moment. Fumbled for my flashlight, its beam cutting weakly through the dark. I wasn't in the woods anymore. The place was vast and empty, a desolate expanse of ice and snow, stretching out in every direction. Jagged spires of ice rose from the ground like frozen teeth, and the wind carried a faint, mournful sound that set my nerves on edge. And then I saw them, figures, moving in the distance. They were tall and thin, their forms barely visible through the fog, swirling snow. They didn't walk. They glided, silent and smooth, their movements unnatural. My breath caught in my throat as one of them turned toward me. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a hollow mask, its surface etched with patterns that mirrored the key. Its eyes were empty, black voids that seemed to pull the light from the air. It raised a hand, pointing directly at me. The sound of the wind grew louder, a deafening roar that carried whispers, soft, urgent voices that I couldn't understand. The figures began to move, gliding toward me with terrifying speed. I turned and ran. The ground beneath me cracked with every step, the ice threatening to give way. Still there, a faint outline in the distance, and I sprinted toward it with everything I had. The whispers grew louder, the figures closer, their presence pressing against me like a physical weight. I threw myself through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The lock clicked into place, and the sound of the wind stopped abruptly. I collapsed in the snow, gasping for breath. The key, still, clutched tightly in my hand. When I looked up, the door was gone. I stumbled back to my house, my body trembling from the cold. I locked the key in a drawer, but it didn't matter. Every night I hear the whispers in my dreams, Feel the cold creeping closer. And sometimes, when the wind howls outside, I see the faint outline of the door, waiting for me to enter. Open it again. The first thing I noticed was the cold. It wasn't just the usual winter chill. It was the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, that makes the air feel heavy and sharp. My breath hung in the air as I opened my eyes. Little puffs of fog that disappeared almost instantly. I sat up in bed, shivering. The room felt wrong. Too quiet. The soft hum of the radiator was gone. So was the drone of the television, replaced by a strange, muffled stillness. I pulled the blankets tighter around me, but they didn't help. The cold was everywhere. That's when I saw the windows. The frost covered the glass, thick and opaque, spreading outward in jagged patterns like veins. At first, I thought it was just the winter weather, but then I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The frost wasn't on the outside, it was inside. I stepped closer, my breath fogging in the frigid air, and reached out to touch the glass. The ice was solid, rough against my fingertips, and it stretched all the way to the edges of the frame. It shouldn't have been possible. The heater had been on last night, and the house was sealed tight. There was no reason for the windows to freeze like that. No reason at all. I checked the rest of the house, hoping it was just a fluke. But every window was the same, covered in frost so thick it looked like the glass had turned to ice. Even the small bathroom window, the one that never frosted over no matter how cold it got, was frozen solid. Panic bubbled in my chest. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. Screen was blank, dead. I hadn't forgotten to charge it, I was sure of that. I tried the light. Switches next. The silence in the house felt heavier now, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I went back to my bedroom and grabbed the flashlight I kept in the nightstand. Its weak beam barely cut through the dimness as I shone it on the windows again. That's when I noticed the marks. At first I thought they were cracks in the frost, but as I looked closer, I realized they weren't random. They were scratches, long and deliberate, etched into the ice from the inside. They formed patterns, symbols I didn't recognize, twisting and curling like something alive. My stomach churned and I stumbled back. I didn't want to look at them anymore, but my eyes kept being drawn to the shapes. They seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, shifting in the corners of my vision. A sound broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned toward the noise. Tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to get in. I forced myself to move, gripping the flashlight tightly as I crept down the hallway. The air grew colder with each step, and my breath came in shallow gasps. The tapping didn't stop. Reached the living room, I shone the flashlight toward the window. At first I saw nothing, just the frost-covered glass, its patterns glinting faintly in the light. But then, as I stepped closer, I saw it. A handprint. It was pressed against the glass, perfectly formed, as if someone had placed their palm against the ice. The print was small, delicate, but it wasn't right. The fingers were too long, the portions slightly off, and the edges of the print seemed to blur, like the frost itself was trying to swallow it. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible sound, a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was soft, insistent, like a voice carried on the wind. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. The whispering stopped. For a moment there was silence again. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed through the house. They weren't coming from outside. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the hallway. The beam of light caught the frost-covered walls, the strange symbols etched into the ice. The footsteps grew louder, closer, though I couldn't see anyone. They stopped just behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. Slowly I turned my head, the flashlight shaking in my grip. In the reflection of the frosted living room window, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, its form barely visible in the dim light. Its face was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. Its breath fogged the air, forming words that dissolved before I could read them. I spun around, but the room was empty, and spread further, crawling toward the edges of the glass like it was alive. The whispers started again, louder this time, coming from every direction. The air grew colder, and the flashlight flickered, its beam dimming. My breath froze in the air, hanging in front of me, like a cloud. And then, it began to change. The mist twisted and curled, forming ladders in the freezing air. Let us in. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, my bare feet slipping on the icy floor as I stumbled toward the front door. The handle was frozen solid, the metal biting into my skin as I twisted it with all my strength. The door wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices, overlapping and echoing through the house. The frost spread across the walls, the floor, even the ceiling, trapping me in a frozen tomb. The symbols etched into the ice glowed faintly, their patterns shifting like they were alive. I collapsed to the floor, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers grew softer, fading into silence. The room was still, the air heavy and cold. And then, a single voice broke through. We're already here. I don't know how I escaped. When I woke up, the frost was gone, the windows clear, the power was back, and the house was warm again. But the marks remained, faint scratches on the glass, barely visible in the daylight. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the tapping again. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. My friends and I had rented a cabin near Blackwater, a lake, far away from the city. The lake was completely frozen over, its surface like a sheet that glass stretching out into the distance. It was beautiful, peaceful even, the kind of place where you'd expect nothing bad could happen. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first day was uneventful. We hiked through the snow-covered trails, built a fire in the brick, the cabin's old stone hearth, and laughed as we tried to ice skate on the lake. The ice was thick, thicker than I'd ever seen, and none of us worried about falling through. The cold bit at our faces, but it was worth it for the beauty of the place. By the second night, the storm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the cabin windows and driving the temperature even lower. Kind meant to scare each other. Ghosts, monsters, all the usual campfire nonsense. It wasn't until later that I noticed something was off. The storm had quieted by midnight, and I decided to step outside for some fresh air. The snow had stopped falling, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting its pale light over the lake. I pulled my coat tighter and made my way to the shore, my breath visible in the freezing air. The lake was silent, frozen solid, its surface reflecting the moonlight like a mirror. But as I stared at it, I noticed movement. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the clouds shifting above. But then I saw it again, something dark and quick, darting just beneath the ice. I froze. My eyes locked on the spot where I'd seen it. The shadows moved again, longer this time, twisting and swirling as if they were alive. I stepped closer, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The ice groaned faintly under my weight, but it held firm. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. I didn't know why I spoke. It wasn't like anyone could hear me, but the silence that followed was worse than the wind. The shadows stopped. They hovered just below the surface, still and shapeless, as if they were watching me. Stomach twist, my instincts screaming at me to run, but I couldn't look away. Then, the ice cracked. A loud, splintering sound echoed across the lake, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The shadows began to move again, faster this time, spreading outward like ink in water. They twisted and writhed, forming shapes that weren't quite human. I turned and ran, the cold biting at my face as I sprinted back to the cabin. By the time I slammed the door shut behind me, my breath was coming in ragged gasps, my hands shaking. My friends. I looked up from the table, their faces confused. "What happened?" Emily asked, standing. "There's something out there," I managed to say. "Under the ice." They exchanged glances, half amused, half concerned. "You're just tired," Alex said. "Or maybe." He saw a fish. "There are trout in the lake." I shook my head. It wasn't a fish. It was something else. None of them believed me, of course. I couldn't even explain it properly. How do you describe something that doesn't make sense? Something that feels wrong on a level you can't explain? I didn't sleep that night. The image of the shadows twisting beneath the ice was burned into my mind. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, made my heart race. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I woke to an empty cabin. Emily, Alex, and Sam were gone, their coats missing from the hooks by the door. I called out for them, but there was no answer. Stepping out into the cold, their footprints led straight to the lake. I followed the trail, the snow crunching underfoot. The lake was still, its surface undisturbed, except for a single crack that stretched across the ice like a scar. My breath fogged in the air as I scanned the shore, desperate to find them. That's when I saw it. 3 sets of footprints led out onto the ice, but none came back. "Emily!" I shouted, my voice echoing across the frozen expanse. "Alex! Sam!" No response. The silence pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I stepped onto the ice, my boots slipping slightly as I followed their tracks. The further I went, the colder it felt, the chill seeping through my coat and into my bones. I stopped when I reached the middle of the lake. My friends had simply disappeared. The ice beneath me groaned, and I felt a wave of unease wash over me. Then I saw the shadows again. They rose slowly, shifting beneath the ice like they were alive. This time, there was no mistaking their shape. They were human, twisted, elongated figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. Their arms stretched upward, reaching for the surface. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The ice beneath me cracked, the sound sharp. My fingers froze and deafening and unnatural. "Help!" I screamed, but no one was there to hear me. The ice gave way. I plunged into the freezing water, the cold stealing the breath from my lungs. My vision blurred as I struggled to surface, but something was pulling me down, their grip cold and unyielding. I felt them clawing at my skin, dragging me deeper into the darkness. And then, nothing. I woke up on the shore, gasping for air. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across. My mind drifted back to the night before, when I'd finally drifted off the snow. So, when I returned to the cabin, their belongings were gone. It was as if they'd never been there at all. But I know what I saw. I know what took them. And every night, I hear it. The sound of the ice cracking, the faint whisper of something moving. Beneath it, waiting for me to return. The snowstorm hit harder than I expected. The wind howled through the trees, whipping snowflakes into my face and blinding me as I trudged down the narrow road. I'd been driving home from work when the storm forced me to stop. The car was useless, buried under drifts of stale weed. Snow, so I decided to walk the mile back to my cabin. It wasn't ideal, but I didn't have a choice. The storm seemed to grow angrier with each step. The air was thick with snow, and the world around me felt impossibly quiet, as though the storm had swallowed all sound. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, and the road I thought I knew so well now felt foreign and endless. That's when I saw it, a faint shape in the distance. Something stuck to a tree at the edge of the road. As I got closer, I realized it was a piece of paper, flapping weakly in the wind. I almost walked past it, but curiosity got the better of me, and I stopped to take a closer look. Gloves fumbled with the corner of the paper, peeling it away from the bark. It was a missing poster? For a moment, I thought it was just another warning about someone lost in the storm. This wasn't uncommon in the area, especially during the harsh winters. But then I saw the picture. It was me. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. The photo was unmistakable. It was my face, down to the scar above my left eyebrow. My name was printed in bold letters across the top. Missing, Adam Carter. The description was disturbingly accurate. Last seen wearing a dark coat, jeans, and black boots. Exactly what I was wearing. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the rest of the poster. The date at the bottom was today. My hands trembled as I stepped back, the poster flapping in the wind like it was mocking me. This had to be a mistake, a prank, someone messing with me. But who? And how could they know what I'd be wearing, where I'd be? Even the storm that had forced me onto this road? The wind howled louder, and I realized I couldn't stand there any longer. My cabin wasn't far. Now, and I needed to get out of the cold. I turned and started walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, terribly wrong. The trees on either side of the road seemed taller now, their bare branches reaching out like claws. Nothing there, just the endless snow. I felt like I was being watched. The storm grew worse, and I could barely see the road beneath my feet. My mind raced, replaying the image of the poster over and over. Who could have made it? How long had it been there? And why did it feel like it was meant for me to find? That's when I saw the second poster. It was tacked to a wooden fence post, half buried in snow. This one was newer, the ink sharper, and the paper free of weathering. I didn't want to look at it. I wanted to keep walking, to pretend it wasn't there. But I couldn't stop myself. It was my face again, my name, my description. But this time the details had changed. The date was still today, but the location had been updated. Last seen walking down Old Hollow Road. My stomach twisted. Old Hollow Road was where I was now. The description was following me. I ripped the poster down, crumpling it in my hands. The wind snatched it away and I watched as it disappeared into the snow. My legs felt like lead as I forced myself to keep moving, my boots crunching in the frozen drifts. I didn't make it far before I saw another one. This poster was nailed to a tree, its edges lined with frost. My face stared back at me, lifeless, cold. The description had changed again. Last seen heading toward the Carter cabin. My cabin. I broke into a run, the cold biting at my face and hands. The snow made it hard to move, each step sinking deep into the drifts. But I didn't stop. I needed to get home. I needed to get away from whatever was happening. The cabin came into view, its faint glow barely visible through the storm. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I approached the front porch, I saw another poster. It was taped to my door. This one was different. The photo wasn't of me anymore. It was of my cabin, the windows dark and the snow piled high. Around the base, the text below sent a chill down my spine. Last seen inside. I tore the poster down, my hands shaking. The paper was freezing, the ink smudged and wet, but the words were unmistakable. Handle, shoving it open and stumbling inside. The cabin was silent. The warmth of the fire had long since faded, and the air was thick with cold. The shadows inside seemed to shift and stretch, like they were alive. And then I saw it. A figure sat in the corner of the room, its head bowed, and its body wrapped in my coat. At first, I thought it was the trick of the light, but then it moved. Slowly, it raised its head, and I saw its face. It was me. My reflection stared back at me, its eyes hollow and lifeless, its lips curled into a twisted smile. As it stood, stepping toward me with jerky, unnatural movements. "You're already missing," it said, its voice a distorted echo of my own. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the room seemed to close in around me. The windows were stood over, the storm outside howling louder than ever. The figure kept advancing, its presence suffocating until it was inches from me, and then everything went dark. I woke up in the snow, the storm gone, and the road eerily silent. Dean, and the posters were gone, but I knew they weren't really gone. They were waiting, just out of sight, following me wherever I went, because now I wasn't just lost. I was missing. It started as a simple hike, the kind I'd done a dozen times before. The weather was clear, the snow crisp underfoot, and the trail through the woods was one I knew well. I'd been looking forward to the solitude, the silence of winter, broken only by the crunch of my boots and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But then the snow began to fall. It started lightly at first, tiny flakes drifting down from a sky that had turned an ominous shade of gray. My car before the weather could worsen. But the further I went, the harder the snow fell, and soon the trail was buried beneath a thick, unbroken sheet of white. I should have turned back. I knew that, but something about the forest felt different. The familiar landmarks were harder to recognize, and the trees seemed closer together, their dark trunks looming like silent sentinels. Direction, and I'd made it through worse weather before. But then I saw the footprints. They appeared out of nowhere, a trail of fresh tracks cutting through the snow. At first, I was relieved. Someone else had been here recently. Maybe I wasn't as far off the trail as I thought. I decided to follow them, hoping they'd lead me back to the path. The tracks were large, clearly left by boots similar to mine, and they moved in a straight line through the trees. I walked quickly, the wind biting at my face as the snow whipped around me. The forest seemed to grow darker with every step, the shadows deepening as the storm intensified. After what felt like an hour, I realized something was wrong. The footprints weren't leading anywhere. They were just circling. I stopped in my tracks, my breath fogging in the freezing air. The prints I'd been following looped around in a wide arc, disappearing into the trees before reappearing ahead of me. I stared at them, my heart pounding. It didn't make sense. I hadn't noticed the curve as I was walking. I should have seen it, felt it, but somehow, I hadn't. A creeping sense of unease settled over me, and I told myself to turn back. I'd follow my own tracks to retrace my steps and get out of the forest. But when I turned around, the footprints were already there, perfectly aligned with the ones I'd been following. I froze, my mind racing. Had I already turned back without realizing it? Had I been walking in circles this whole time? The snow erasing any landmarks I might have recognized. The wind howled through the trees, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like laughter. It was soft, distant, and gone before I could be sure I'd heard it at all. I started walking again, this time more slowly. I followed the prints carefully, scanning the woods for any sign of the trail or something familiar, but the tracks just kept circling, over and over, leading me nowhere. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The footprints weren't mine. At first, I thought they were same size, same tread, same depth in the snow. But as I looked closer, I realized the pattern was slightly different, the spacing between the steps just a little too long. Whoever had made these prints had a stride like mine, but not quite. I backed away from the tracks, my chest tightening. The laughter came again, louder this time, echoing through the trees. It was high and unnatural, like the sound of wind scraping across ice. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The forest fell silent. I turned and started running, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. The snow clung to my boots, slowing me down, but I didn't stop. I just needed to get away, to find something, anything, that would break the endless loop of trees and snow. But no matter how far I ran, the footprints were always there, looping ahead of me like a cruel joke. Forest seemed darker now, the trees pressing closer, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. The laughter came again, right behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the forest was empty, just shadows and snow. But then, at the edge of my vision, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing motionless in the trees. Its face was pale, almost luminous, and its eyes were black pits that seemed to swallow the light. It tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it moved. It didn't walk. It glided, silent and smooth, its form flickering like a shadow caught in the wind. I stumbled back, my chest heaving, and turned to run, but the footprints were already ahead of me, circling back toward the figure. "No," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "This isn't real." But it was. The cold, the snow, the figure. It was all too real. The laughter grew louder, filling the air, and I realized with a sickening dread that it wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping and echoing, coming from all around me. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. I could see it more clearly now. Its skin was cracked and brittle, like porcelain, and its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. It raised a hand, long fingers, beckoning me forward. I turned and ran, my legs burning with effort. The snow was deeper now, the air colder, and every breath felt like shards of glass in my lungs. I didn't know where I was going anymore. There was nowhere to go. The footprints were everywhere, circling and crisscrossing, trapping me in an endless loop. The laughter followed me, growing fainter as the forest around me began to blur. My vision dimmed, and the world tilted, the cold pulling me down like a weight. I fell to my knees, body trembling, and the last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the figure, standing over me, its grin widening. When I woke up, the forest was gone. I was lying in the snow, surrounded by footprints that stretched in every direction. The storm had passed, and the sky was clear, but the air was still heavy with a sense of wrongness. I stumbled to my feet, my body aching, and looked around. The footprints were mine now, but I didn't remember making them. The snowstorm came out of nowhere. One moment, I was hiking up the familiar ridge near my cabin, the air crisp and clear, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The next, the sky turned an eerie gray, and thick flakes began to fall, faster and heavier than I'd ever seen. Within minutes, the trail had disappeared under a blanket of white. I told myself to stay calm. I knew these words well, and my cabin wasn't far. But the wind picked up, howling through the trees and stinging my face. I squinted against the storm, trying to find the markers I'd set along the trail, but they were gone, buried. The snow was up to my knees now, and every step felt like a struggle. The cold seeped through. My gloves and boots, biting at my skin. I had to find shelter. Any shelter. That's when I saw it. A dark opening in the hillside. At first I thought it was just a trick of the storm, shadows playing against the snow. But as I moved closer, I realized it was real. A tunnel carved into the snow, perfectly smooth and round, like a giant pipe leading into the earth. It didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been anything like this here. But the storm was relentless, and I didn't have a choice. I stepped inside, grateful for the break from the wind. The walls of the tunnel were solid snow, packed tight and glistening faintly in the dim light. The air was still, almost too still, and unnervingly cold. My breath hung in the air like a ghost. I told myself it was fine. The tunnel must have been made by an avalanche, or some natural process. I'd wait out the storm here, and then head back once it passed. But as I moved further in, something about the place felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in behind me, the opening shrinking in the distance. I turned back, my boots crunching in the snow, but when I looked again, the entrance was gone, swallowed by the hum. The tunnel, as if it had never been there. Panic bubbled in my chest. I reached out, running my hands along the walls, but they were solid, too solid. No light seeped through, no hint of the storm outside. Listlessly in both directions, the air heavy and suffocating. I started walking, hoping to find another exit. The snow beneath my feet was hard-packed, making my steps echo in the eerie silence. My flashlight barely pierced the darkness ahead, the beams swallowed by the curved walls. Then I noticed something strange. The tunnel was getting smaller. At first it was subtle. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower. I hunched slightly, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the further I went, the worse it got. Soon, I was crouching, the ceiling brushing the top of my head. The air felt colder now, biting at my lungs with every breath. My heart pounded as I moved forward, the walls pressing in on either side. It was as if the tunnel was alive, shrinking around me, trapping me. I dropped to my hands and knees, crawling through the snow. My gloves were soaked, my fingers numb. I tried to turn back, but the way behind me had closed in, the walls sealing like a vice. There was only one way to go, forward. The tunnel twisted and turned, the path narrowing with each step. My breath came in ragged, gasps, and my flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced on the icy walls. I tried to focus, to push down the rising panic, but the space was suffocating, squeezing the air from my lungs. And then I heard it, a faint sound, distant but unmistakable, a whisper, soft and low, like wind through cracks in the ice. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound came again, closer this time, echoing through the tunnel. Come, closer. The voice sent a shiver down my spine. It didn't sound human. It was too cold, too sharp, like the ice itself was speaking. I pressed on, my hands and knees scraping against the snow as the tunnel grew impossibly tight. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and echoing, filling the space around me. I couldn't understand the words, but their tone was insistent, urgent. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound, vibrating beneath my fingers. I couldn't go any further. The tunnel had narrowed to the point where I could barely move, the feeling pressing against my back. My flashlight flickered again, the beam dimming until it went out completely, plunging me into darkness. The whispers stopped. For a moment there was silence. My breathing was the only sound, loud and ragged in the stillness. I screamed, kicking out, but the space was too tight. The cold touch moved up my leg, slow and deliberate, like fingers tracing my skin. I thrashed, panic overwhelming me, but there was nowhere to go. The whispers started again, louder this time, filling my ears with their icy cadence. The walls pressed closer, the air growing colder and thinner. I'd escape, but it was no use. And then, the voice came again, clear and sharp, right next to my ear. "You can't leave." The walls collapsed. I woke up in the snow, gasping for air. The storm had passed, the sky a pale gray, and the forest was silent. My body ached, and my clothes were soaked, but I was alive. I stumbled to my feet, my legs trembling, and looked around. There was no sign of the tunnel, no opening, no packed snow, nothing, just an endless expanse of white, untouched and pristine. But I can still hear it, the voice in the back of my mind, whispering in the stillness. "You can't leave." The snowstorm had forced me off the road hours ago. My car sat useless on the shoulder, buried under a growing blanket of snow. I'd started walking, hoping to find shelter before the cold could bite too deeply into my fingers and toes. The world was white and endless, the wind howling like it had a voice of its own. That's when I saw the first sign of civilization, a faint glow in the distance, just barely visible through the storm. My heart leapt. A village, maybe? Somewhere warm? I pushed on, the cold biting at my cheeks, until the shapes of houses began to take form. The village was small, only a dozen or so buildings arranged around a central square. The houses were old, their wooden walls dark against the snow. No smoke rose from the chimneys, and no lights shone in the windows, but the eerie stillness didn't register at first. I was too, focused on finding shelter. Then I noticed the snowmen. They were everywhere, standing in neat rows along the street, scattered in front of houses, clustered around the square. Each one was different, but all of them shared the same unsettling detail, their faces. Instead of traditional coal eyes and carrot noses, they had jagged features, carved from ice, their mouths twisted into sharp, unnatural grins. I stopped in my tracks, the wind howling around me. Something about the snowmen made my skin crawl. They were too perfect, their shapes too deliberate, and their eyes, shards of glass, or crystal, seemed to catch the faint light, glinting like they were watching me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. The village was silent, except for the wind. I told myself it was just an abandoned town, the snowmen left behind by the last residents. Maybe it was a tradition, or a festival that no one had cleaned up after. But the thought didn't make me feel any better. I stepped into the square, my boots crunching loudly in the snow. The snowmen seemed to be gathered here in greater numbers, forming a circle around the center. I avoided looking at their faces, but I could feel their jagged grins pressing into the back of my mind. In the center of the square stood the largest snowman of them all. It was massive, its body made of 3 enormous spears of snow, down at the small wooden box at its base. Curiosity tugged at me, though every instinct screamed at me to leave. I moved closer, my breath visible in the freezing air. The box was simple, unadorned, and dusted with snow. It looked like a chest, the kind you'd see in an old attic. I knelt down, brushing the snow from its surface. The wood was smooth, worn by time. There was no lock, no latch, just a faint carving on the lid, a single jagged smile, like the ones etched into the snowman's faces. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't stop myself. The lid creaked as I lifted it, the sound sharp in the silence. Inside was a single object, a shard of ice, long and thin, glinting faintly even in the dull light. It looked like it had been broken off from something larger, its edges jagged and sharp. The air grew colder, biting at my skin. I reached out to touch the shard, my fingers trembling. But, as soon as I did, a sound broke the stillness. A crunch. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. One of the snowmen had moved. Its arm, previously at its side, was now raised, pointing directly at me. "No," I whispered, stumbling back. "That's not possible." The snow beneath my feet gave way, and I fell hard, the shard of ice slipping from my hand. When I looked up, the snowmen were closer. They hadn't moved, not that I'd seen, but the circle around the square had tightened. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in frantic bursts. The snowmen loomed over me now, their faces twisted into sharper grins, their jagged eyes glinting with malice. The wind carried a sound, faint but growing louder, a low, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps in the snow. I backed away, my hands trembling. The snowmen didn't move, but the sound grew closer, the crunching filling my ears until it felt like the ground itself was alive. My foot caught on something, the chest. The moment my fingers closed around it, the sound stopped. I thought the snowmen froze in place, their grins suddenly empty, lifeless. The air was still, the wind gone. The next. But I wasn't alone. A shadow passed over me, long and thin, stretching from the massive snowman in the center of the square box. It was looking at me. The shadow moved, sliding across the snow like liquid. It stretched and twisted, forming a shape that rose from the ground, featureless save for the same jagged smile carved into the snowmen. It reached for me. I ran. The village blurred around me as I sprinted down the street, the shard of ice clutched tightly in my hand. The snowmen lined the road, their faces grinning as I passed. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The crunching sound was behind me again, faster now, chasing me. The edge of the village came into view, the rows of snowmen thinning. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop. The crunching was so close I could feel it vibrating in my chest. I broke through the last line of snowmen and stumbled into the open snowfield beyond. The sound stopped. The air was silent, heavy. The village was gone. The houses, the square, the snowmen, all of it had vanished. Only the shard of ice remained, its surface slick with something dark and cold. I threw it into the snow and ran, the wind howling in my ears. When I finally reached my car, it was buried under snow, but I didn't care. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and waited for the sun to rise. I never found the village again, but sometimes, when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls, through the trees I see them, rows of snowmen, standing in the distance, their jagged grins, watching, waiting. The snow was falling thick and fast, swallowing the narrow mountain road ahead. My car had long since become useless, its tires spinning helplessly in the icy drifts. I'd been walking for hours, the cold biting at my face and fingers, when I finally saw it, a dark silhouette against the endless white, the chalet. It stood at the edge of the forest, its wooden frame sagging with age, the windows dark and empty. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time, but I didn't care. The storm was getting worse, and I needed shelter. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the stillness. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of wood and decay. The main room was sparse, a fireplace, a few pieces of old furniture, and a staircase leading up to what I assumed were bedrooms. I lit a fire with the matches I always kept in my bag, the flames flickering weakly in the hearth. The warmth was a relief, even if the atmosphere of the place made my skin crawl. The walls were lined with old photographs, their black and white faces staring down at me with expressions that seemed too sharp, too aware. It's just an old house, I told myself, trying to push down the unease rising in my chest. Nothing to be afraid of. I found a small bedroom upstairs. The bed was old but still sturdy, the mattress covered in a thick layer of dust. I brushed it off as best I could, wrapped myself in my coat, and lay down, exhaustion pulling me under almost immediately. I woke up to silence. At first, I thought it was still night. The room was bathed in a faint bluish light, the kind that comes before dawn, but something felt off. The air smelled different, fresher, and the bed beneath me didn't creak when I moved. I sat up slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The room had changed. The dust was gone. The furniture was polished. The wooden floor clean and gleaming. A thick rug lay beneath the bed, and the walls were adorned with colorful tapestries. A fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth filling the room. I scrambled out of bed, my heart racing. This wasn't possible. The chalet had been abandoned, decrepit. I'd seen it with my own eyes. The window caught my attention. I rushed to it, pulling back the curtain. The forest was still there, but the snowstorm had disappeared. The trees were greener, healthier, and the mountains, in the distance, were untouched by the heavy snow I'd seen the night before. I heard voices then, soft, muffled, and coming from downstairs. I hesitated, my pulse quickening, but curiosity outweighed fear. I crept down the staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. The main room was alive with activity. People dressed in heavy woolen clothes bustled about, their faces unfamiliar. They were laughing, talking, moving with purpose as if they belonged there, decorated with fresh flowers and candles. I stepped back, my foot creaking on the wooden floor, wide with surprise. "You're awake," she said, her voice warm but edged with something I couldn't place. Where am I?" I stammered. The room fell silent. Every face turned to look at me, their expressions unreadable. The woman had stepped closer, her gaze sharp. "You are in the winter hearth," she said. "The storm brought you to us." Winter hearth? The name tugged at something in my memory, but I couldn't place it. "I don't understand," I said. "This chalet was abandoned." Her smile faltered. My head spun. This couldn't be real. I had walked into a decaying, empty chalet, not this vibrant, bustling place. "What year is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman's brow furrowed, and the others exchanged uneasy glances. "It is the year 1823, she said slowly. I staggered back, my mind reeling. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. But every detail, the clothes, the furniture, the fire, felt too real to be a dream. I turned to leave, desperate to find the door, but the woman grabbed my arm. Her grip was stronger than I expected. "You must stay," she said, her voice firm. "The storm outside is unforgiving." "There is no storm," I snapped, pulling away. "I need to go, now." I ran to the door and yanked it open. The cold hit me like a wall, and I stumbled into the snow. The forest loomed around me, darker and denser than I remembered. The storm had returned, the wind howling like a living thing, whipping the snow into blinding spirals. I turned back to the chalet, but it was gone. In its place stood a crumbling ruin. Its roof caved in, its windows shattered. The warmth, the people, everything I'd seen inside, had vanished, replaced by silence and decay. I staggered back, the snow swirling around me. The air grew colder, the wind sharper, carrying whispers that seemed to come from all directions. "You should know, like..." The voice was faint but unmistakable, and it sent a chill down my spine, searching for the source, but there was no one there. The snow beneath my feet shifted, and I realized too late that I was sinking. The ground seemed to collapse, pulling me down into the freezing dark. I clawed at the snow, gasping for air, but the cold swallowed me whole. I woke up on the floor of the chalet, my body trembling and soaked in sweat. The fire in the hearth was nothing but embers, the room dark and silent. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The chalet was as I'd first found it, abandoned, decayed, lifeless. But something was different. The photographs on the wall were gone, replaced by paintings of faces I recognized. The woman, the villagers. Their eyes seemed to follow me, their expressions, sharp and knowing. I ran out into the snow, the cold biting at my skin. The forest stretched endlessly around me, silent and still. But as I looked back at the chalet, I saw it. In the window, a figure stood watching. Its face was pale and hollow, its eyes empty, but its presence was undeniable. And then, the door creaked open. I never found my way back to the road. The forest seemed endless, the snow deeper with every step. But I know one thing for certain. I was never supposed to leave that chalet. And now, I don't think it will let me go. The storm had already swallowed the town by the time I arrived. Snowflakes were thick in the air, swirling around in a chaotic dance that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The small lake by the woods was frozen solid, the ice a mirror-like surface reflecting the dark, overcast sky above. I had been walking for hours, trying to make it back to the small cabin where I was staying. The wind howled through the trees, biting at my skin, and I had already lost track of the trail. The woods felt unfamiliar, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels, their dark shapes making. It was hard to tell which direction I had come from. In desperation, I stumbled toward the lake. I knew it wasn't far from the cabin. If I could find the edge, I could follow it back. The snow-covered ground beneath me crunched as I walked, my boots sinking with each step. When I reached the lake, I stopped, my breath misting in the cold air. It was still, too still. The only sound was the wind whipping through the branches. The frozen lake stretched out before me, its surface so smooth and perfect that it almost looked unreal. It was as though everything, time, movement, sound, had been erased. I took a few steps toward the edge, my eyes scanning for any sign of a way to continue. That's when I saw it, a shape in the ice. It wasn't a crack or a fissure in the surface, but something strange, an indentation, like a perfect circle, right in the middle of the lake. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. The outline of what looked like a face. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, the shadows playing against the smooth surface of the ice. But no, it was unmistakable. A face. My face. I stumbled back, a chill running through me that had nothing to do with the cold. The face was frozen into the ice, its features contorted in an expression I couldn't quite place. The more I stared at it, the more the feeling of wrongness grew. Something about the eyes, the mouth. They weren't mine. They looked like mine, but they weren't. The face was too wide, the eyes too big, the smile too sharp. I didn't know what to think. My heart raced as I took another step closer, my eyes locked on the reflection of the face. But as I did, something strange happened. The smile in the ice moved. It wasn't just a shift, like the ice settling beneath the weight of the snow. No, the face in the ice, as though they were looking at me. I froze, unable to move, my breath catching in my throat. My mind screamed at me to look away, to run, but my body wouldn't listen. The ice beneath me seemed to hum, the ground vibrating, with a strange energy. Then, the smile deepened. The face in the ice twisted and grinned even wider, and I could swear I saw the reflection of my own eyes widening in the ice, like I was smiling back. "Stop," I whispered to myself, shaking my head. "It's just ice. It's just the cold playing tricks." But the grin remained. It was as if the face had come alive beneath the ice, its grin a mockery of my own fear. The longer I stared at it, the more the figure in the ice seemed to move. It was as if the frozen face was alive, mocking me, waiting for me to blink or look away so it could claim me. I tried to step back, but my legs wouldn't obey. The ground beneath me felt like it was sinking, the cold creeping up through my boots, through my skin. The wind howled louder, and the snow began to fall in heavier sheets, blurring everything around me. I took a breath, and the smile in the ice stretched even wider, impossibly so, until the face seemed to take up the entire frozen surface. "No," I gasped, shaking my head, finally tearing my eyes away from the reflection. But when I looked up, the landscape had changed. The trees, the cabin, everything around me was obscured. Affirmative answer by the blinding snowstorm. The lake was no longer just a frozen expanse. The ice had expanded, spreading out like a vast mirror, and now, it wasn't just my face reflected in the ice. The ice was everywhere, surrounding me, following me, multiplying in the snow. The wind seemed to scream in my ears. the sound deafening as it carried a voice. My voice, whispering my name over and over. Look again. I stumbled back, my feet slipping on the ice, my hands reaching out for something, anything, to hold on to. The face in the ice moved with me, following my every step, grinning wider with every breath I took. My own voice echoed in my ears, a mocking, twisted version of myself. My vision blurred as I turned, trying to find my way back, but the world was closing in. The ice seemed to stretch out forever, the landscape narrowing with every step I took. The snow swallowed me, its cold fingers pulling at my skin as the figure in the ice grew closer. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the reflection of my own face, grinning, mocking, and far too wide, smiling back at me. I woke up in the snow, cold and shaking. The wind was still, the storm had passed, and the lake was now just a vast sheet of ice, smooth and empty. There were no faces in the ice anymore. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak beneath me, and I looked around. The world felt too quiet, too still. I had imagined everything, the faces, the voice, the strange twisting reflection. But when I looked down at my hands, I saw it. The marks, long, jagged cuts, like fingers had, scratched at my skin. And when I glanced up at the lake, I saw the smile. It was still there, not in the ice, not in the reflection, but in the air around me, stretched wide and waiting. It was waiting for me to smile back. It all started when I got lost during a hike in the mountains. I had set out on a routine walk, wanting to enjoy the solitude of the snowy woods before the winter really set in. The weather was cold but manageable, and the snow was thick, almost like a soft carpet underfoot. But soon, the wind began to pick up, and the snow came faster. The trail I'd been following quickly vanished under the heavy flakes, and I found myself surrounded by an unbroken sea of white. It wasn't long before I realized I'd wandered off the main trail. The world around me felt empty, the quiet broken only by the howling wind. I was trying to find my bearings, but everything looked the same. Endless trees and snow, a never-ending stretch of white and gray. I turned in circles, hoping to spot something familiar, but all I saw was more snow. Just as panic began to rise in my chest, I saw something ahead of me. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the storm, but as I approached, it became clearer. A town, a small village, nestled between the trees, with wooden houses lined along narrow streets. It was strange. I hadn't seen any signs of civilization on my hike, and this town didn't show up on any map I knew. I felt a strange pull to walk toward it, relief flooding my chest. The storm had worsened by now, and I needed shelter. As I entered the town, I felt the temperature drop even further, but it was quiet, almost too quiet. No lights were on in the houses, and the windows were all dark. There was no sign of life. I stepped deeper into the town, the crunch of my boots in the snow the only sound breaking the silence. Streets, no signs of any living people. I walked for what felt like hours, but the town seemed to stretch endlessly. The snow around me grew deeper and thicker, but I didn't tire. There was something about the place that felt both calming and unsettling. Everything was too still. Eventually, I came to the town square. In the middle, there was a fountain, its water frozen in place, the stone basin coated with thick layers of ice. The wind howled, and snow swirled around the square, but everything was still, too still. That's when I saw them. People. At first, I thought they were just shadows in the distance, but as they drew closer, I realized they were standing perfectly still in the snow. Their eyes were vacant, staring ahead, their faces frozen in expressions that seemed empty and hollow. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. They didn't move. They didn't blink. They just stood there, as if waiting. I tried to call out, but my voice was swallowed by the wind. I stepped back, my breath coming in, sharp, shallow bursts. I was about to turn and leave when one of the figures turned its head. Slowly, stiffly, its eyes met mine. I gasped, the world around me seeming to close in. The figure's lips parted slightly, and I could have sworn it smiled, but it wasn't a human smile. It was too wide, too twisted, as if his expression was forced. I backed away quickly, heart racing, but as I turned to leave, I realized something terrifying. The Snow behind me had disappeared. The trail I had come from had vanished. There was no path, no sign of the forest I had walked through to find this place. I was trapped. The wind picked up again, howling through the streets of the town, and the people began to move. Slowly, at first, but with increasing speed, they began to shuffle toward me, their eyes still locked onto mine. I turned and ran. I didn't look back, but I could hear them behind me. Soft footsteps in the snow, their movement stiff and unnatural, like they weren't fully alive. I sprinted through the streets, my legs heavy with fear. I tried to find an exit, but it felt like the town was closing in on me, like the streets were stretching endlessly, leading me deeper into this nightmare. And then, as I ran, I saw something else. A large, dark building at the edge of the square, its doors slightly ajar. The wind pushed me toward it, and I hesitated for only a moment before darting inside. The door slammed shut behind me, and I leaned against it, gasping for air. The building was an old church, its pews covered in dust and the stained glass windows darkened with grime. The air inside was cold, but I didn't care. I had to find a way out of this town. I had to leave. I heard footsteps in the hallway outside. The shuffling was slow, methodical, and I could feel their presence through the walls, their eyes on me. I hurried through the church, my steps echoing in the silence. At the back, there was another door leading out to what looked like an alley. I pulled harder, my heart thumping in my chest. And then, the sound of footsteps grew louder. The door closer. Doorway. They didn't move, but their eyes, they were still locked on me, like they knew everything about me. The smile from earlier began to return to their faces, that twisted, unnatural grin that sent a wave of nausea through my stomach. I turned back to the door, desperate now. I could feel the air getting colder, the temperature dropping even more. The wind began to howl louder, shaking the walls of the church. I pulled on at the door one last time, and finally it gave way, swinging open. Outside, the storm had only grown worse. The snow was falling harder, and the town behind me was swallowed by the white. I didn't care. I ran, ignoring the chill that clawed at my skin, pushing myself forward into the thick snow. But then I stopped. I realized something strange. The path in front of me, snow-covered and untouched, wasn't the same path I had come from. It was different. The trees looked wrong, the shapes unfamiliar. It wasn't the same forest. I turned around, my heart sinking, and saw it. The town was gone. It wasn't behind me anymore. The street, the buildings, the people, all had vanished, leaving only the empty, snow-covered, and behind me, the town was gone. But as I stood there, frozen in fear, I noticed something else. The snow around me was changing. The footprints in the snow, my footprints, were no longer just mine. They were joined by others, slow, deliberate, dark shapes in the snow, each one following me. And I realized, with growing terror, that I was still in the town. The people, those smiling figures, were still here. They were all around me, in the snow, in the air, and they were waiting for me to return. The snowstorm came out of nowhere, thick and fast, wrapping the world in a blanket of white. One minute the sky was clear, and the next the wind picked up, howling through the trees, like a living thing, and I knew I couldn't stay there for much longer. I had to walk. The road was barely visible through the storm, the snow piling higher with every passing minute. My boots sank deep into the snow, making each step feel like a struggle. The cold was biting, and I pulled my scarf tighter around my face, the wind seeping through the gaps in my clothes. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw a shape through the falling snow. A small cabin, its lights flickering faintly in the distance. Relief washed over me. I had no idea who lived there, but at this point, I didn't care. I just needed warmth. I stumbled toward the cabin, the snow swirling around me. My legs were numb, my face frozen, but I kept moving. When I reached the door, I knocked, my hands shaking from the cold. The door creaked open almost immediately. A man stood in the doorway, tall and thin, his face hidden behind a scarf. His eyes were dark, and his gaze seemed to pierce through the storm, directly into me. For a second, I thought I saw Something flicker in his eyes. A flash of recognition, maybe. "You're late," he said, his voice low and calm, almost too calm for the situation. "Come inside." I hesitated, confusion creeping in. How did he know I was coming? I hadn't even planned to stop here, let alone knock on his door. But before I could question it, the man stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. "Please," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You must come in. The storm is worse than it looks." I stepped inside, eager to get out of the cold. The warmth hit me like a wave, and I sighed in relief, peeling off my wet jacket. The cabin was small, cozy even, with a crackling fire in the hearth and thick rugs on the floor. There were bookshelves lining the walls, old and worn, and a single window through which I could barely make out the swirling snow. "Thank you," I muttered, shaking off the snow. I was stranded on the road. I didn't think I'd find anyone out here. The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he watched me with that same intense look, his gaze never leaving mine. "Kind," I told myself. There was no need to be scared. "You're lucky I was here," he said after a moment. "Not many make it through this storm." "Yeah," I said, offering a nervous smile. "It's pretty bad out there." The man nodded, stepping away from the door. He walked to a small table by the fire and motioned for me to sit. "I've been expecting you," he said, his voice calm and steady. I blinked, the words echoing in my mind. "What do you mean? You've been expecting me?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a seat across from me, his eyes never leaving mine longer. "I don't know how I got here," I said, trying to fill the awkward silence. "I was just driving, and then the storm, it just came out of nowhere." The man smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was knowing, like he already understood. "You didn't come out of nowhere," he said softly. I frowned, unsure of what he meant. "What do you mean?" The man's expression grew serious. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "You were always supposed to be here." My heart skipped a beat. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I suddenly felt like I was in the presence of something much older, much more dangerous than just a kind stranger. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he stood up and walked over to the window, peering out into the snowstorm. His back was to me, but I could still see the faint outline of his figure in the dim light. And then I heard it. A voice, low and calm, echoing through my mind. "Your name is Sarah." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I hadn't told the man my name. I had never said a word about who I was, but he had said it. My name. Like he had. Always nodded. "How do you know my name?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The man turned slowly, his face unreadable. "I told you. I've been expecting you." Before I could respond, the man moved quickly, almost too quickly, and grabbed my wrist. His grip was cold, unnaturally cold, and my body stiffened in fear. "Why are you doing this?" I gasped, pulling away. "You should have left," he said softly. "You should have turned back." Suddenly, the room around me seemed to change. The walls felt closer, the air thicker. The snow outside had stopped, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire. I felt dizzy, like I wasn't. Sure what was real anymore. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but the man was already there, his hand on my shoulder, his voice whispering in my ear, "You shouldn't have come here. It's not time for you yet." And then, I saw it. In the reflection of the window, I saw myself, but it wasn't just me. I was standing beside the man, but my reflection was different. It was smiling, grinning, a twisted, distorted smile that wasn't my own. I spun around, but there was nothing behind me. The room was still. I turned back to the window and saw the reflection again, still smiling, still twisted. "Please," I whispered, my voice shaking with terror. "What's happening?" The man stepped closer, his face inches from mine, and in that moment, I knew he wasn't human. His eyes were dark, empty, like something much older than flesh and bone. "You've always been here, Sarah," he said, his voice cold as ice. "The storm is just the beginning." I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The world around me seemed to twist and stretch, the walls closing in. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The reflection in the window grinned wider, and then in a flash, everything went dark. When I woke up, the storm was gone. The cabin was still. The man was gone. But my name was still in the air, echoing softly in the silence. Sir. And I knew, with growing dread, that I was never meant to leave. The first time I saw it, I thought I was just seeing things. I had been walking through the woods for hours, the snow deep beneath my boots and the wind howling like a living thing. The storm had come out of nowhere, fierce and relentless, and I had lost the trail. It was the kind of snowstorm that made everything feel muffled, like the world was pressing in on me from all sides. The trees around me were dark, their branches weighed down by the heavy snow, and every step I took seemed to sink deeper into the cold, biting earth. I was lost. The storm wasn't letting up, and I was beginning to lose hope. The cabin I was staying in was supposed to be just a few miles away, but the blizzard had made it impossible to navigate. The trees were so thick here, and the snow was piling up so fast that I couldn't even tell which way I had come from. Every direction looked the same. I had almost given up when I saw it, a flickering light in the distance. It was faint at first, barely visible through the storm. At first, I thought it was a trick of the wind, the way the snowflakes shimmered in the gusts. But as I squinted against the wind and snow, I realized it wasn't just the storm playing tricks. There was something there, something that shouldn't be. A lantern. It was hanging from the low branches of a tree, casting a warm, yellow glow against the otherwise frozen landscape. I felt a wave of relief. Someone must be nearby. A light, in this storm, had to mean shelter, safety. I stumbled toward it, my steps slow and cautious. The closer I got, the clearer it became. The lantern was old, very old. Its metal frame rusted and worn, but there was something strange about it. The flame inside, despite the freezing wind and snow, burned brightly, without flickering. It was as if the cold had no power over it, at all. I reached out and touched the lantern, my fingers grazing the metal. It was warm, impossibly warm, considering the weather. I pulled my hand back quickly, surprised. But the warmth lingered in my palm. The light from the lantern seemed to grow, bathing the surrounding snow in a golden glow. I took a deep breath. The air was thick with the smell of burning oil, and the lantern's glow cast strange shadows around me. The wind howled even louder now, but the light was holding strong, as if it were defying the storm itself. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt wrong. The lantern, which had seemed like a sign of hope, now felt like a trap. I looked around, trying to find the source of my unease. But the storm had closed in even tighter. The trees looked darker, more oppressive, as they were leaning in closer. Without thinking, I reached for the lantern again, pulling it off the tree and cradling it in my hands. It was heavier than I expected, like it had been there for much longer than it should have been. And then, as I took another step, I heard it, a low, whispering voice. It came from behind me, faint but unmistakable. Leave it. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. Just the trees, their branches swaying. In the wind, the snow swirling in the air. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling. My mind was playing tricks on me, I told myself. The cold was getting to me. But the voice had been clear, too clear to ignore. I took a few more steps, heading in the direction I thought was my cabin. But as I walked, the lantern's light began to flicker. It wasn't the wind this time. It was as if the flame inside the lantern was reacting to my movements, growing dimmer the further I walked, until it was barely more than a faint glow in my hands. The whispering voice came again, louder this time. Leave it behind. I froze, clutching the lantern tighter. The wind had died down, but the air was colder now. The snow around me seemed to grow heavier, like the storm was closing in from all sides. Be beyond the glow of the lantern anymore. It was as if the world had narrowed down to just the light in my hands. The voice wasn't just whispering anymore. It was a low growl, distant, but closer than it had been before. Leave it, it repeated. or you will be trapped. Emma. I turned around, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The trees seemed darker now, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The path behind me had disappeared. There was no trail to follow. It was as if the snow had swallowed everything whole, leaving only the lantern to guide me. I tried to take another step, but the lantern's flame flickered again, and this time, the light completely vanished. I was plunged into darkness. Panic rose in my chest. I fumbled for the lantern, shaking it in my hands, but there was no light. The voice came again, closer now, almost in my ear. You shouldn't have taken it. I turned in a circle, my heart pounding in my chest, the snow swirling around me. I could feel the cold creeping into my bones. But it wasn't the snow that was making me shiver. There was something else, something behind me. I turned around quickly, expecting to see something in the darkness. But all I saw were the trees, their silhouettes stretching high into the night sky. The snow was falling faster, and I could barely make out my own feet beneath me. And then I heard it, the sound of something moving in the snow behind me. Slow, deliberate steps. I froze. Leave it, the voice whispered, louder now, growing more insistent. I turned, the lantern still cold in my hands, and I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the storm, coming toward me. It was tall, wrapped in a cloak that blended into the snow. The figure's face was hidden, but I could feel its eyes on me. I took a step back, my hands trembling. I wanted to scream, but the cold stole the sound from my throat. I wouldn't catch. The figure moved closer, its shadow growing taller, until it was right in front of me. Leave it, it said, its voice sharp and cold as the wind itself. I tried to throw the lantern away, but the moment it left my hands, it floated back toward me. As if the storm itself were pulling it back, the lantern was bound to me. And then, the sound of a low, mournful laugh. I felt the cold wrapping around me, squeezing the air from my lungs, and I realized, too late, that the lantern had never been a gift. It had been a curse. I woke up in the snow, my hands empty, and the lantern nowhere to be found. The storm had passed, the sky clear above me, but the ground was still covered in snow, and the trees stood silent and still. I turned around, but the path I had been following was gone. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, and all I could see were the shadows of the trees. I never found the lantern again, and when I finally made it back to the cabin, I couldn't remember how long I had been gone. But sometimes, when the wind picks up, I still hear the whisper, leave it. The lake was silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the world had paused, holding its breath. The ice stretched out before me, a vast white expanse with only the occasional crack, breaking the smooth surface. It was late afternoon, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the frozen world. I had come out to the lake to clear my head, to walk away from the stress of everything that had been weighing on me. I didn't expect to find anything strange or unusual, just the quiet, just the solitude. But then, something happened that I still can't explain. I had been walking for about an hour, the cold biting at my face and hands, the wind cutting through my coat when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was just the way the light was playing with the ice, casting strange reflections. It was moving differently. It seemed separate, like it wasn't mine. I stopped walking, squinting against the pale sunlight, and looked down. My shadow was stretched out before me, but it didn't look like it should. It was distorted, its shape twisting unnaturally on the ice, and it was moving, slowly at first, but then it began to crawl toward me. I blinked, trying to clear my vision. The wind whipped around me, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I turned my head, looking around, but there was nothing. Just the endless expanse of ice and snow, the silent trees at the edge of the lake. The only sound was the crunch of my boots in the snow. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. My shadow, still twisted and creeping, followed every movement I made, and then without warning it surged forward. I gasped and stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My own shadow was chasing me. It stretched and twisted across the ice, moving faster than I could. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had taken form, become something that was no longer just a reflection of me. I started to run, my feet slipping on the ice, my heart racing as I heard the sound of the shadow, sliding across the frozen surface, following me, never stopping. I could feel it, its presence like a weight pressing down on my back. I turned my head, trying to catch a glimpse of it, but the faster I ran, the faster it followed. It was keeping up with me, matching my every movement, like it was a part of me but also separate. Something else. I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps as I ran across the ice. The wind was howling now, cutting through my coat, freezing my skin. I could see the trees at the Kushesi edge of the lake, the distant shore, my only hope of escape. I pushed forward, my legs burning, my eyes fixed on the goal ahead. But no matter how fast I ran, the shadow was always there. Closer now, its shape-shifting, twisting, almost as if it were trying to engulf me. I could see it clearly now. It was not my own. It had the same shape, but the edges were wrong, jagged, like the shadow was trying to break, free of its form. And in the edges, in the darkness, I thought I saw something, moving inside it, a shape, a figure. The realization hit me then like a punch to the stomach. It wasn't just following me, it was after me. And if it caught me, I couldn't bring myself to finish the thought. I pushed myself faster, my feet skating across the ice, my breath coming in desperate bursts. The door was getting closer. Shadow, pulling me back, chasing me, closing in. I was almost there. Just a few more steps. I could make it. I had to. I reached the edge of the lake where the snow met the forest. I turned sharply, running toward the trees, but then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it was ahead, moving toward me with a speed that made my blood run cold. It had outpaced me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my body frozen with fear. The shadow was there, waiting for me, stretching out on the snow. It was no longer a part of me, it was something else entirely, something dark and endless. It reached out toward me, its twisted form stretching toward mine, feet, its edges writhing like tendrils of darkness. I took a step back, but the ground beneath me cracked, the ice splitting with a loud, jarring noise. The shadow surged forward, wrapping around my legs, pulling me down. I screamed, my hands grasping at the ice, trying to break free, but the cold seeped into my skin, and the shadow dragged me down, pulling me toward the blackness that waited in the center of the frozen lake. I don't know how long I struggled. I don't know how long I fought to break free, but when I finally looked up, I realized the world had changed. The ice around me was smooth again, untouched by any struggle, and the shadow was gone. I was lying on the ground, covered in snow, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The sun had set, and the lake was silent again. The wind had died down, and the trees were still. I looked around, but there was no sign of the shadow, no sign of anything unusual. Had it all been a dream? Had I imagined it? I slowly stood, my body sore, my legs trembling. I had to get back to the cabin. I had to leave. This place, this cursed lake, behind me. But as I started walking, I glanced down. My shadow stretched out before me, and this time, it wasn't moving the way it should. It was twisting, writhing, as if something was trying to break free from its form. And I realized, with a sickening chill, that I had never escaped. The shadow was still with me, and it was waiting for the moment when it would chase me again. It started like any other trip. I was traveling for work and had to stop in a small, remote town. The night. The weather was awful, snow falling thick and fast, making the roads nearly impossible to drive. I was exhausted and just needed a place to rest for the night. I spotted the hotel at the edge of the town. It looked old, a little worn down, but it had a sign that said vacancy in bright red letters. I figured it was as good as any place to sleep. The town was small, nothing but empty streets and a few scattered buildings. The storm made it feel like the whole world was shut out. I walked into the hotel lobby, which had a warm, musty smell that seemed to come from the old furniture. Greet me at first. He just looked up, nodded, and then went back to reading his newspaper. I told him I needed a room for the night, and without saying much, he handed me a key with a small, brass number 5 on it. He didn't say anything more, just nodded again and went back to his paper. It was strange, but I didn't think much of it. The hallway to my room was dim, lit only by flickering lights above. The floor creaked under my feet as I walked, and the air had a heavy, stale feeling to it, like the building hadn't seen any real use in years. When I got to my room, I opened the door and stepped inside. The room was small and simple, with a bed covered in an old, faded blanket, and a wooden dresser that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The window was covered with heavy curtains, and the only sound in the room was the hum of the old radiator. I locked the door behind me, unpacked my things, and sat down on the bed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence was deafening. I hadn't seen a single person since I entered the hotel, and it made the whole place feel unnervingly empty. I decided to take a shower and try to relax. But as I turned on the water, I thought I heard a faint sound from the hallway outside. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper. I ignored it, thinking it was the building settling or the wind rattling the old windows. But then I heard it again, a faint tapping on the door. I froze. Response: to be at my door. I quickly wrapped myself in a towel and stepped toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. But before I could open it, the tapping stopped. A few seconds passed, and I heard nothing more. Confused and nervous, I opened the door, half expecting someone to be standing there. But the hallway was empty, no one was there. I closed the door again, locking it, and quickly retreating to the bed. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in my stomach. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the wind? Or maybe I had imagined the tapping. But the rest of the night only made me more uneasy. I tried to sleep, but every little sound made me jump. The building creaked and groaned in the cold, and the occasional rattle of the window made me tense up. I checked the door again to make sure it was locked. It was. Around midnight, I heard the tapping again. This time it was louder, more insistent. But I didn't get out of bed. Longer it went on, the more the tapping sounded like breathing. Deep, slow breaths. It was coming from behind the door. I wanted to open it and check. I wanted to know if someone was playing a trick on me, but fear, it kept me in place. My heart hammered in my chest as the sound grew louder, closer. I could almost hear a voice, but it was too faint, too soft to understand. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at the door, but eventually, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. My thoughts raced as I tried to figure out what to do next. What if I wasn't alone in this hotel? What if there was something or someone here, with me, hidden in the shadows? The next morning I woke up feeling drained. The storm had stopped, but the world outside was still covered in snow. I couldn't wait to leave. I packed my bags and walked back down the hallway to check out, hoping to see anyone, in the hotel. But the lobby was just as empty as the night before. The receptionist sat behind the counter, still, reading his newspaper. At the hotel, his gaze flickered to me for a moment, and then he slowly looked back at his paper. "No," he said simply. "You're the only one." I stared at him, confused. I had seen signs of life, heard the tapping, but no one had been in the hotel except me. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and left, walking out into the cold morning. As I stepped outside, I glanced back at the hotel, the tall, dark building standing silent against the snowy landscape. I looked up at the windows, wondering if I had imagined everything. But there, in the top window, was a figure. It was faint, blurry, but unmistakable. A dark shape, staring out at me from behind the glass. I didn't stop to look longer. I didn't want to. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel hadn't just been empty the whole time. Something, or someone, had been waiting for me there, watching from the shadows. And when I finally left, I knew it wouldn't be the last time I saw that figure in the window. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. I'd been hiking in the forest for years, enjoying the quiet and the solitude. I knew these woods well, knew where the paths twisted, where the trees stood thick, and where the birds sang their songs. But on that day, Everything felt wrong. The weather had turned cold overnight, and the ground was blanketed in thick snow. The trees, usually lush and green, were now bare and skeletal, their branches reaching out like fingers. The world was silent, except for the crunch of snow beneath my boots. I had wandered off the usual trail, searching for a new path, maybe a stream or a clearing I hadn't seen before. As I ventured farther in, I began to feel like I was being watched. It was as if the forest itself was alive and something in it didn't want me there. I tried to shake the feeling off. There were always odd moments on long hikes, and I had been hiking alone long enough to know that my mind could play tricks on me. At first, I thought it was just an illusion. A door, in the middle of the forest, standing alone, framed by the snow-covered trees. I stopped in my tracks, blinking to make sure my eyes weren't deceiving me. Unmistakably real. An old wooden door, completely encased in ice, frost, and the ice was so clear that I could almost see through it, though the world beyond the door was hidden by a haze of snow. It didn't make sense. There were no buildings here, no houses, no structures of any kind, just the endless expanse of forest and snow. Yet there it was, standing as if it had always been there, a frozen peak, a door to nowhere. I stepped closer, my boots crunching in the snow, my breath visible in the cold air. The door was large, heavy, and made of wood that had clearly been weathered by time. But the ice covering it was strange, almost unnatural. It was too thick, too perfect, as if someone had crafted it deliberately. I reached out to touch the ice, and immediately a cold shock ran through my fingers. It wasn't like the usual cold of snow or winter air. It was deeper, as if the ice was alive and I could feel something pulsing beneath the surface. I pulled my hand back, a chill running down my spine. It was then that I noticed something even more unsettling. There was no handle, no knob, no way to open the door, just a smooth, frozen surface. But despite that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me on the other side, something calling me to open it. I stepped back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My heart was beating faster now, and my mind raced with questions. Who had put this door here? Why was it covered in ice? And, most importantly, what was behind it? I felt like I was standing at the edge of something I shouldn't be. The wind howled through the trees, and the snow began to fall harder, faster. It was as if the forest itself was urging me to leave, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the door. It felt important, like it had been, waiting for me. Without fully understanding why, I reached out and placed my palm on the icy surface of the parisha. Door was alive. It sent a shock through me, and I jerked my hand back, but not before I heard it. A whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Come in. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away from this place, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't move. The whisper had sounded like it was right next to me, and yet there was no one in sight. I stepped back, my legs shaking, but before I could turn to leave, the door moved. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift. The ice creaked, the frost round the frame cracking. I took another step back, but the door opened, ever so slightly, just enough to let a thin sliver of darkness peek through. That was when the fear truly set in. I didn't know what was on the other side of that door, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. The snow was falling harder now, blurring my vision, and the wind pushed against me, but I didn't stop. My boots slipped on the icy ground as I sprinted through the trees, my breath coming in sharp gasps. But then, something stopped me. A sound, barely audible at first, but growing louder. A soft, scraping noise. Something moving through the snow, coming in shallow, panicked bursts, silent against the storm. Then I saw it. A figure, tall and shadowy, moving through the snow behind me. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. It was more like a shadow, a dark shape that stretched unnaturally long across the snow. Edges blurred, shifting like smoke. But it was there, following me. I tried to run again, but my legs wouldn't move fast enough. The figure grew closer, the scraping sound growing louder with every step. It was closing in on me, and I could feel its presence. Cold and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. I didn't know where the figure had come from. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I couldn't outrun it. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The door. It was open now, fully ajar. The icy frame, flaming in the dim light. It was calling me, beckoning me to return, to step through. I didn't hesitate. I ran back to the door, throwing myself through it, not caring what lay on the other side. Everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground, the snow around me untouched, still and calm. I sat up, my head spinning, and looked around. The forest was gone. I was standing in a place that looked nothing like the woods I had just been in. The trees were twisted, blackened, their branches stretching out like claws. The air was thick and heavy, a dark mist swirling around me. The ground beneath me was frozen, but not like the ice-covered door. This was a frozen wasteland, empty and barren. I didn't know how I had gotten here, or where the door had gone, but I felt it. Something was watching me, waiting for me to make my move. And in the distance, I thought I saw something moving. A shadow, a figure, and it was coming closer. It started as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I had always dreamed of seeing the aurora borealis, the northern lights, in person. The swirling colors, the dancing lights in the sky, had always fascinated me, and when I finally got the chance to travel to a remote part of Norway, I jumped at it. The first night I saw them, I thought I had entered a dream. The sky was alive with colors. Greens, blues, purples. So vibrant and surreal, I almost couldn't believe it was real. I stood there, in awe, my breath coming in cold, visible puffs as the lights danced above me, flickering and shimmering like a living thing. I didn't know it at the time, but that was the moment I made my mistake. I should have stayed where I was, enjoyed the beauty from a safe distance. But the aurora was calling to me. Something about it was magnetic, irresistible. I found myself walking toward the edge of the Pawtucket, small town, where the lights were brighter, more intense, seeming to pull me deeper into the snow-covered forest that bordered the town. I hadn't planned to wander so far. The wind was biting, and the cold made my face sting. But the lights, they seemed to beckon me, urging me to go further. I didn't stop. I kept walking, the snow crunching beneath my boots, the ground soft but steady. The light from the aurora seemed to guide me, casting strange shadows across the snow. It felt like the world had fallen away. Like, in the midst of it, right after the attack, nothing else existed except for the lights above and the soft, eerie quiet around me. As I walked deeper into the woods, I began to feel uneasy. The beauty of the aurora had started to feel wrong. There was a strange stillness in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The further I walked, the more intense the lights became. The aurora wasn't just in the sky anymore. It was surrounding me, pulsing in the trees, painting the snow in shades of green and purple. The air was thick with an unnatural energy, and I could feel it in my bones. And then I saw it. In the distance, partially hidden by the trees, there was something that didn't belong, a shape. At first, I thought it was another person, maybe someone else who had been drawn in by the lights. But as I got closer, I saw that it wasn't human. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally, like the trees themselves had come alive. Its body was wrapped in shadows, moving with the same fluid, twisting motion as the aurora above. The closer I got, the more I could see it. Its face was pale, almost translucent, with eyes that were too wide, too black. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, its lips cracked and torn, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the light. I froze. Everything inside me screamed to turn around and run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, staring at this thing, this creature that didn't belong in this world, caught in the glowing lights of the aurora. It stepped forward, its long fingers reaching toward me, its movement slow but deliberate. The sound of its steps was soft, muffled by the snow, but each one felt like a hammer against my chest. The air around me grew colder, and the lights above seemed to pulse faster. More. Violently. Where are you here? The voice came from it, low and raspy, like the wind itself was speaking. To its mouth. I didn't know how to answer. I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight, my body trembling, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something primal. The creature took another step forward, and for the first time, I noticed something worse than its eyes. It was poised. Eyes, worse than its face. The shadows around it were moving, swirling, like something was alive within them. Something that wasn't part of the creature itself. A darkness that was more than just absence of light. It was a presence, and it was drawing closer to me. You shouldn't have followed, the creature said again, its voice now an almost soothing whisper. But now that you're here, you won't leave. I opened my mouth to scream, to call for help, but nothing came out. The wind howled louder, now swirling around us, pushing me closer to the creature, dragging me toward the swirling shadows. The aurora above me pulsed brighter, and then, without warning, it was gone. The sky went completely dark, and for a moment, I couldn't see anything. My heart raced in the pitched neck silence, and I was sure the creature was still there, just waiting for me to make a move. But when the light returned, the aurora was gone, and the creature was gone. The forest was silent, the night was still, the snow had stopped falling. Everything around me seemed frozen in time, and I was alone. I turned to leave, my legs shaking beneath me, but when I looked back, I saw something in the jiddo. Snow. Footprints. Large, deep footprints. That weren't mine. They stretched across the snow, leading back toward the dark trees. I didn't know where they led, but I knew I couldn't follow them. Not anymore. I ran back toward the town, my chest tight with fear, the path in front of me now completely obscured by the falling snow. My feet stumbled in the dark, my breath short, my mind racing, with thoughts of the creature, the shadows, the way the aurora had turned into something much more terrifying. When I reached the edge of the forest, I looked back one last time. The lights were gone. The sky, it was dark. But the footprints, still fresh, still deep in the snow, were there, and they were waiting for me to return. I should have never gone out there. I should have stayed inside, safe and warm, where the storm couldn't reach me. But there was something inside me, something that pushed me out of the cabin and into the blinding blizzard. It started as a normal winter morning. The snow had been falling steadily through the night. That wasn't unusual for this part of the country. I had just finished breakfast and was sipping on my coffee when I noticed how quiet it had become. The wind had died down, and for the first time in days there was no howling outside. I went to the window and looked out into the white expanse of snow that stretched as far as I could see. The storm had passed, but the world was still buried in snow, and the path leading from the cabin was completely covered. The silence was thick, almost oppressive. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind picking up again, carrying some distant sound. But no, it was clearer now, almost as if it were right outside the cabin. A voice. My voice. "Come outside," it said, soft and clear, carried by the wind. "I need you." I froze, staring at the door. My heart began to race. The voice sounded like mine, but it wasn't me. It couldn't be. I was inside, alone. The only sound, outside, was the whisper of snow being blown around by the wind. I told myself it was a trick, that I was imagining things. The storm had probably stirred up some strange noises, some echoes from the world outside. But the voice, it sounded too real, too urgent. I shook my head, trying to shake the fear off. I had to get some fresh air, to clear my mind. That's when I made the mistake. I opened the door. The cold hit me like a slap in the face, whipped around me with a fierce bite. The landscape was a blur, nothing but swirling white in every direction. But there, cutting through the storm, "Come outside. I need you." It was louder now, clearer, almost like it was coming from behind me. My heart thudded in my chest as I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. Only the snow, falling in endless sheets. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring out into the storm. My breath was visible in the air, a thick mist that seemed to evaporate into the nothingness. Insistent, more desperate. I'm here. Come to me. I stepped out of the cabin, the snow crunching beneath my boots, my eyes scanning the white world around me. The wind howled in my ears, and the snow stung my face. But the voice was louder now, closer. It was unmistakable. It was my voice. It was calling me. "Where are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the storm. "What do you want?" I couldn't see anything through the blizzard, nothing but the swirling snow and the vague outline of trees in the distance. But the voice, my voice, was still there, urging me forward. "Follow me." I took a hesitant step, then another. The snow was deep, and it was hard to keep my footing, but I followed the sound of the voice, the pull that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the storm. Urged to follow that voice, stronger than my fear. "Just a little farther," it said, soothing, like a whisper in my ear. "I need you to see this." My breath came in quick, shallow bursts now, the cold creeping into my bones. I had no idea how far I had walked, how much time had passed. All I knew was that the voice was still there, still calling me, leading me deeper into the blizzard. I couldn't turn back now. I didn't know why, but I couldn't. The snow was so thick now that I couldn't see the cabin anymore, couldn't see the path. The world had become a blur of white and gray. And still, the voice called to me, just a few steps ahead. "Look," it urged. "Look at what I've found." I took another step, and then I saw it. Through the haze of snow, a shadow in the distance. A figure, standing in the storm. A person. No, not a person. It was me. The figure was standing there, just barely visible through the snow. It was me. Or, at least it looked like me. My exact height, my exact posture, my coat, my boots. But it wasn't me. The figure's face was blank, its eyes hollow and dark, and it was smiling. I froze in my tracks, my heart slamming in my chest. The voice, my voice, was coming from the figure. "You came," it said, the voice dripping with a cold, mocking sweetness. "I knew you would." I backed away, the panic rising in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But the figure, I took a step forward. I could feel it moving, closer. Its eyes locked on me, that eerie smile, never leaving its face. Why are you doing this?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, still smiling. "Because you had to know," it said softly. "You had to. Know that you would follow, that you always would." The snow around me began to shift, the wind growing louder, more violent, as if the storm was alive. The figure stepped forward again, its movements slow, deliberate, its smile growing wider, stretching unnaturally. "No," I gasped, my feet scrambling in the snow. "No, please, no." But the figure didn't stop. It reached out toward me with long, cold hands, its fingers stretching farther than they should have. I turned to run, but the wind whipped against me, and the snow seemed to press in from all sides. The world had closed in, the figure's voice echoing in my ears, mocking me, urging me to turn around. I couldn't escape it. "Turn around," it whispered, its voice right behind me now. The last thing I remember is the feeling of cold fingers closing around my shoulder. When I woke up, the storm had stopped. The snow was still, the world around me quiet. I was back near the cabin, but everything felt wrong. My heart was still pounding, my body cold, and stiff from the freezing wind. The figure was gone. The voice had stopped. But as I stood there, looking out into the woods, I heard it again, faint, but unmistakable. "Come back to me." And I knew, deep in my bones, that the storm wasn't over. The voice would always call me back, and I would follow. The wind was the first sign something was wrong. I'd been hiking alone in the mountains for a few days, far from the nearest town, when the weather started to change. The air grew colder, the fiesta hours, the festival, the screaming, the burning of the carts, wind sharper, and a thick layer of fog rolled in, making the world around me blur into a gray, endless void. I didn't think much of it at first. Mountain weather could be unpredictable. But then I stumbled upon the cave. I'd been following a narrow trail along the cliffside when I saw the dark opening in the rock. It was small at first, barely noticeable among the snow-covered boulders. But as I stepped closer, I saw it more clearly. An opening in the rock, like the mouth of something ancient, covered in frost and ice. The permafrost should have sealed it shut long ago. That's what the maps had said, at least. There were no known caves in this part of the mountain. This should have been a dead end, just more rock and snow. I paused, uncertain. Something about the cave didn't sit right with me, but curiosity pushed me forward, deeper than I could see. The air was cold, colder than the outside, and a strange damp smell wafted from within. My breath fogged in the air, and I hesitated, wondering if I should turn back. But the pull to explore was too strong. I adjusted my backpack, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. Something was pressing in from all sides. My flashlight flickered as I moved deeper, casting long shadows that danced on the walls of the cave. The floor beneath me was slippery, covered in ice and frost, and the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural cold. I shivered as I walked, my boots crunching in the snow. The deeper I went, the more the air seemed to change, and I began to feel an odd sense of unease. The cave felt alive, like it was breathing. Every step I took seemed to echo louder, and the silence that surrounded me was thick, almost suffocating. I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't explain why. Then I saw it. Something on the wall, partially hidden by the shadows. At first I thought it was just a crack in the rock, but as I stepped closer, I saw that it was more than that. Strange markings, carved into the stone, twisted symbols that seemed to writhe under my gaze, as if they were alive. They were old, ancient, and something in the back of my mind told me that I should leave before I learned more. But I didn't listen. I couldn't. The markings seemed to draw me in, their patterns strange and hypnotic. I traced them with my fingers, and the moment I touched the wall, I felt a shock of cold, a jolt that ran up my arm and made my whole body tense. I jerked my hand back, my breath catching in my throat. Author, that's when I heard it. A low, whispering sound, coming from deep within the cave. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it wasn't. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned around quickly, my heart racing, but I saw nothing. The cave was empty, just the winding path ahead and the cold, silent. I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I was alone in a cave, and the isolation was messing with my head. But the whispering continued, growing louder, like it was calling me. Come closer, the voice seemed to say. It was soft, almost melodic, but there was something wrong about it, something that made my stomach turn. I took a step back, unsure if I should leave, but the voice was louder now, a soft hiss against my ear. Come closer. Before I could react, something shifted in the darkness ahead of me. A shape, slowly emerging. From the shadows, a figure standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. Its face was hidden, but the outline of its body was unmistakable. Human, yet not. I froze, unable to move. The figure didn't speak. It didn't move, just stood there, its presence, suffocating the air around me. I could feel it, this pressure, like something dark and ancient was rising within the cave, something that had been waiting for this moment. Then, the whispering stopped. For a moment there was complete silence, and I thought the figure was gone. But when I looked up again, it was closer, its outline more defined, and this time, I saw its face, pale, ashen, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. A wide, gaping mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, as if it had been waiting for me to get closer, waiting to feed. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. My feet slipped on the icy floor, and the light from my flashlight bounced. Wildly as I sprinted down the cave, my breath ragged in my chest. The cave seemed endless, the walls closing in, narrowing with every step I took. The whispering started again, louder now, echoing off the walls, filling my ears with words I couldn't understand. But one thing was clear. Whatever was chasing me, whatever had been waiting in the dark, a human. I reached the entrance of the cave, the light of day just beyond the opening, and for a brief moment I thought I was free. But when I looked back, I saw it. The figure, standing at the mouth of the cave, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. It didn't move, didn't chase me. It just stood there, watching, waiting. I stumbled backward, my foot slipping on the icy edge of the cave, and I nearly fell into the dark. Abby's. But I caught myself, pushing away from the entrance and running, not daring to look. When I finally reached the safety of the town, I collapsed into the first warm building I could. Mind, gasping for air, my heart still racing. The others there tried to calm me down, telling me I must have imagined it all, that the cold had gotten to me. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I felt. And when I looked at my hands, I saw something. A mark, deep and cold like a bruise, running across my palm. It was a symbol, one I had seen inside the cave. I never told anyone what I saw that day. I never went back to that part of the mountain. And I never told anyone about the cave. But I still hear the whispering sometimes. In the back of my mind, it calls to me, telling me that the cave isn't finished with me yet. And I fear that one day, it will come for me again.